Morning, everyone. I think we should probably make a start. We start at 10:30 and it's just past 25 minutes past, so just a few words from me. First of all, thank you everyone for coming. This has been a very long project and I can't believe the day is here already. And I'm very pleased that people are actually here to witness it, so thank you for that. A lot of you will know me through French studies, but because this is across the modern languages, a few of you won't know me, so just very quickly on me. My name's Kit, and I finished my PhD last year on Zola, the 19th century writer. It was use of myth in his novels, and it really turned out that this myth is about body in illness. And that's how this conference came about, because I really want to sort of delve a bit more into that, because it was just very interesting. I'm now a research fellow at Therapeutic, and that was where I did my PhD as well. And what I found really interesting about Zola was how literature can construct the body in illness. And I think I really wanted to hear about that from other people, see how they think about it, and also across the modern languages. And we have lots of modern languages here, speakers from 5 languages: Spanish, French, Turkish, Italian, German. And I'm sure lots and lots of questions will come up during the day. But I think 3 basic questions we can just sort of think about and have in the back of our minds. The first one, how does literature help us understand and express illness? And the second one, does literature as an art form, does it give us an insight that can't really be accessed elsewhere? What's the difference between art, pictorial arts, visual arts, and literature, the written word? And then, really, I suppose my core idea is, core thought, what do we mean by the pathological body? And I think we'll be talking about that a lot during the day. For those of you who tweet, we have Wi-Fi, and the network is UOL conferences. There are notices put up around the room. There's no password, so you just log on. And please, if you do tweet, try and use the hashtag #PathBodyLit, because that will ensure that all the tweets are kept together, so people who can't attend and who are interested in what we're talking about today, they'll be able to follow in one long stream of tweets. And finally, practical matters. Toilets, you may have found those already, but you need to go across the hall through the door, and the gents are on this level, and the ladies are down a level. There's no fire drill, but if suddenly the fire alarm does go off, you just have to go through the cafe and just follow the signs. Lunch will be in G35, which is a couple of doors down. It's where we have the tea and coffee at the moment. And I hope that you'll all be able to stay for drinks at 5:30 when we can talk about what we've been listening to throughout the day. So I'll hand over to Damien, who's chairing the first panel, and we'll start.
Okay, welcome everyone to this first panel. 3 speakers covering 3 different nations, in whichever way they wish to use that term. Spain, Turkey, France, so it promises to be a very wide-ranging, interesting panel. So I'd like to welcome then our next speaker, James Illingworth from the University of Leicester, who's going to be speaking to us on French 19th century novelist Georges Sand, and his paper is entitled Georges Sand, Sickness and the Body Politic, 1870 to 71.
pregnant pause, sorry. Here we go. Okay, so despite a deep and sustained scholarly interest in the ways in which medicine and literature can inform one another, research in what has come to be known as the medical humanities tends to ignore the works of Georges Sand. Sand was one of the 19th century's most prolific writers, for those unfamiliar, perhaps even of any nationality, and certainly one of its most prominent women writers. Her status in France was as something of an A-list celebrity. Indeed, when Nadar was pioneering the art of photography, Sand, pictured many times here, was one of his favourite subjects. Yet, while Sand's contemporaries, including Balzac, Flaubert, and above all Zola, have provided fertile ground for research in the medical humanities, Sand has been overlooked. This is perhaps unsurprising. While scholars including Peter Brooks or Henri Mitterrand have identified the body as the object par excellence of 19th century narratives, Sand scholars have been at great pains to note the absence of the body in Sand's texts. François G. Bayer has argued that Sand's texts perform a, quote, quasi-negation of the body, end quote, in favour of reflecting the soul, and Margaret Cohen has proposed Sand as a chief practitioner of the sentimental social novel, which omits bodily description, downplaying material appearance to intensify the reader's sympathetic response to the suffering protagonist. Béatrice Didier, too, has suggested that tout l'art de Georges Sand aura consisté, par un jeu extrêmement subtil, à suggérer continuellement la présence du corps féminin, et en particulier du corps de Lélia, sans jamais le décrire, créant un effet d'attente sans cesse déçu qui favorise le travail de l'imagination du lecteur. When the general consensus amongst scholars is that the body is absent from Sand's texts, it stands to reason that those same texts would have little to say on the subject of illness and disease. However, I have news for these scholars. In this paper, what I want to suggest is that on the one hand, the body is far more than an absent presence, and that reading Sand's texts without accounting for the corporeal is to miss a crucial dimension of her writing. To do so, I will focus on the text she produced during and immediately following the unrest caused by the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 and the subsequent Paris Commune, paying particular attention to the presence of illness and the way Sand depicts both patients and those who seek to treat them. But to place my argument in context, I want first to point out that Sand in fact held a significant interest of her own in medical practice. In her autobiography, she describes how, as a child, her tutor Deschartres would give her anatomy lessons, and she later talks at length about her time caring for an ailing Frédéric Chopin in Mallorca. Usually, if anyone knows anything about Georges Sand, it's that she dated Frédéric Chopin. In her correspondence, she writes of her experience working alongside local physician at La Châtre, Charles de Lavaux, and the inventory of her library at Nyon suggests not only that she owned medical texts, but also that she knew their authors personally, since many of them bear autographed inscriptions. At the invitation of her friend Dr. Gaubert, she was also in attendance at 2 of the 11 sessions held by Dr. Piger that sought to prove Mesmer's theories of human magnetism. In 1837, the Académie de Médecine sought to definitively put an end to the debates surrounding the theories of Mesmer's theories and offered a prize of 3,000 francs to anyone who could offer definitive proof that Mesmer's theories were verifiable. In what has since become known as the Piger affair, Dr. Piger submitted his daughter, Léonide, whom he magnetized, blindfolded, and placed in a trance. Piger's proposition was that by running her fingers along a pane of glass placed against a book, his daughter was able to read the book in question. Although Piger's demonstrations were deemed to be fraudulent by the awarding committee and they never gave him the money, he held 11 salons in Paris in advance of the official demonstration, which also never took place. And Sand was invited to attend 2 of these salons with her friend Carlotta Mariani, possibly because of her celebrity status. Maybe he thought it would lend credence to what he was doing. Or perhaps as a favour to her friend Dr. Gaubert. But beyond indicating Sand's general interest in medical debates, this particular case is pertinent because of its direct relation to both body and text. This is perhaps an overreading, but this case seems to indicate an interest on Sand's part as early as 1837 in different forms of bodily knowledge. Irrespective of what motivated Sand's attendance, this case encourages a reading of Sand's texts that attends to medical modes of understanding. This medical dimension was certainly sensed by Michel Rosier in her debut film Georges Qui, which, in addition to the auspicious accolade of being Gilles Deleuze's only acting credit, there it is, it also presents a rather iconoclastic biopic of Sand, but Rosier chose to begin precisely with Sand assisting Delaveau in a medical procedure. She even has Sand hanging an anatomical skeleton from the chandelier in her bedroom. Yet, among scholars, very few have examined the medical dimensions of her texts. That Sand's literary discussions in medicine have been overlooked is likely a result of her supposedly idealist or sentimental aesthetic, which is also what scholars generally attribute to her decanonization. Most of her texts were completely out of print within 10 years of her death, and have only rediscovered in the 1980s or 70s. The few considerations of the medical aspects of Sand's texts that have followed along these lines tend to be limited to three particular novels: Indiana of 1832, Lélia of 1833, and La Petite Fadette of 1848. Mireille Bossis, for example, has surveyed the presence of illness in the works from the first half of Sand's career. She promised to follow up on the latter half, but never got round to it, and noticed that diseases were scarcely named, with the exception of Lélia's cholera, suggesting instead a more purely aesthetic function to Sand's depiction of illness and disease. Similarly, Hannah Thompson has suggested that illness in Indiana, La Petite Fadette, represents desire, and usually manifests a form of desire that is taboo. And François Kerle-Weguian suggests illness is an indicator, if not of an ill sexuality or an unwelcome sexuality, then of a complete lack of sexual activity altogether. I agree with these assertions to a certain extent, but illness in Sand's texts, I think, is always political. And so the intention of this paper is twofold: to broaden thinking about illness in Sand to work produced after 1848, well after 1848, because we're thinking of the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, and to suggest that reading Sand's text with a view to the medical offers new perspectives on the long-standing debate over whether to consider Sand a sentimental idealist writer more interested in affairs of the heart. The figure of the doctor, I hope to show, stands as a counterpoint to the figure of the reader, and reading Sand's doctors figurally in turn suggests new ways of reading her texts. That I could have worded that better, possibly, but hopefully you're following me. So, over the 2-year period in question here, Sand produced two main texts. The first, the Journal d'un voyageur pendant la guerre, the diary of a wartime traveller, is autobiographical. The text comprises a series of letters Sand wrote over the course of the Franco-Prussian War, essentially to keep herself sane, she says. She describes the lack of communication to the provinces as a result of the conflict, which is where she lived, and the lack of contact with others, and writing her experiences of the conflict allowed herself space to work through her thoughts and emotions. Most striking in the context of this paper is the very final entry, this last letter, which she dates as the 10th of February 1871, which was, I think, 2 weeks after the armistice that ended the Franco-Prussian War. And she looks to the future. While at once hoping that this war does not mean the death of the Republican dream and that France will be reborn, she also cautions against the great illnesses of nations. These sicknesses, it seems, are wealth and pride. L'Allemagne aussi renaîtra, riche et fière aujourd'hui. Elle sera demain plus malade que nue de ces grandes maladies des nations, nécessaires à leur renouvellement. Now, this text offers little beyond what she calls a fervent prayer to the spirit of France as a means of overcoming these illnesses. She doesn't give any concrete ways forward. It's a prayer, a prayer that seeks to preserve the liberté de la parole, écriture orale, liberté de réunion, liberté du vote, liberté de conscience, all taken from the Declaration of the Rights of Man from the Revolution. But I would argue that this image of the sick body politic, which she establishes at the end of this text, is crucial to a thorough understanding of the novel that she produced shortly afterwards. I think the two should be read as leading directly into each other. So this journal appeared in installments over the course of 1871. That same year, Sand produced one other text, also in installments, that offers a meditation on the social and political situation of France at the time, one that again uses illness as a central image. While the Journal narrates the events of 1870 and 71 in real time, the novel Franquia displaces the discussion to the end of the Napoleonic era, with the text opening as the Russian army marches into Paris. In what is also a rare move for Sand, the main events of the text take place almost exclusively in Paris. Sand is quite famous as a pastoral, entre guillemets, writer. Most of her texts take place in the countryside, whereas this one absolutely doesn't. In fact, I would describe this text as probably Sand's most realist novel. Now, in the corporeal narrative model that Peter Brooks identifies as paradigmatic of the 19th century text, the bodies he discusses are those, quote, emblazoned with meaning within the field of desire, end quote. This desire to know the body is at the heart of Franquia, a text that turns on a conflict between a marquise and a young orphan for the love of a Russian soldier. The Marquise de Thièvres, jealous of the preference that this Prince Diomède Mourzakin shows to the titular Franquia, whom he had saved by chance some years before during Napoleon's Russian campaign, tells Franquia that Mourzakin killed her mother. So Franquia's mother died in 1814, and this woman who's jealous of the affections that this prince is showing to this young girl makes up this lie that her mother was killed by the prince. Now, although this is a lie, the machinations of Mourzakin's uncle, the plot's quite complex, the Count Ogorskoy, place enough doubt in Franquia's mind that in her confusion she suffers a form of delirium and then kills the prince herself. Now, this brief plot description demonstrates the centrality of desire in the novel and posits Franquia as yet another iteration of the trend identified by Brooks. However, one particular character subverts this paradigm, I think, and this is the doctor, Faure, who is twice summoned to attend to Franquia during her delirium. Now, Faure's skills are already indicated through his associations with a celebrated historical medical practitioner. The narrator tells us that Faure studied under Dominique Jean Larrey, the chief surgeon to Napoleon's forces between 1797 and 1815. According to Barry O'Meara's Napoleon in Exile, the former emperor is said to have described Larrey as, quote, the most honest man that he ever knew, vigilant and indefatigable in his exertions for the wounded, end quote. During this period, Larrey was, again, kind of a celebrity figure. This comparison even extends to Faure's appearance, who resembled him a little, quote unquote, and deliberately replicated his clothes and hairstyle to the extent that when Franquia first meets him, she actually thinks that she is in the presence of this celebrated Napoleonic doctor. Now, Faure's diagnostic process confirms this initial positive impression. When Franquia tries to tell him that what she is suffering from is nothing, quote unquote, and Mourzakin's valet echoes this opinion, stating simply that she's lost her mind, Faure insists that he examine Franquia alone, so he removes everyone else from the room, all these figures in positions of power, which Franquia does not have. He then takes her pulse, offers her water, calms her down, and then asks her to tell, as calmly as possible, the tale of how she came to be under Mourzakin's care. By the end of 10 minutes, we are told, he knew everything about the whole Franquia's life and established a precise account of this situation. Now, throughout this novel, those in positions of power have seen Franquia as an object to be conquered or possessed. In this way, we are presumably encouraged to read the text as a political allegory, one seemingly confirmed by Franquia's name. Franquia is France in Old French. Franquia, the character, then, can be figured as contested territory, subject to the machinations of those who hold greater power than she does. Yet within this context, Faure, the doctor, stands out. He takes her seriously, granting her a level of agency that others have sought to deny her. Faure's interpretation of the situation is indeed precise, and he suggests that in order to cure herself, as it were, Franquia has been deceived by a rival, and that the best way to proceed is for her to leave, extract herself from the situation. By combining approaches that consider both body and mind, Faure is able to arrive at an accurate conclusion. But the patient in this case fails to heed her doctor's advice. She remains with Mourzakin, attracted by the wealth and power. Remember those same issues that Sand identified as being the maladie des nations. And it is here that Mourzakin's uncle, the Russian Ogorskoy, concocts a scheme to claim Franquia for himself. He sends Mourzakin to the Marquise's box, and when Franquia complains of an oncoming migraine, he secretly dismisses the valet who is waiting with a carriage and tells Franquia that Mourzakin is with Thiers. So he's laid this trap, essentially. Unlike Faure, Ogorskoy projects onto Franquia what he wants to see and misinterprets her silent shame, believing that she was dying of desire to accept his invitation to dinner, when in fact she's trying desperately to get away from him. Distraught, she sneaks into Mourzakin's residence to ascertain the truth of her mother's death, to get to the grips of this lie that was told at the beginning of the text, with the intention to kill herself with a knife Mourzakin had given her for protection. However, overcome and unconscious of her actions, she kills him in his sleep. It is at this point in the narrative that the doctor reappears to examine Mosakin's body. The police do not suspect Fonkia. Like the unknowable bodies Brooks describes, hers leaves no trace, and a verdict of suicide is given. They can't find any evidence that she was ever in the room. The room is somehow locked from the inside. Fonkia's body provides the impetus for the narrative's denouement, since it is desire for her body that impels the actions of both Mosakin and Ogotskoy. Just as Brooks suggests that this desire to read the body is an impossibility, the quite literal attempt by the police to detect the traces of Fonkia's body finds nothing. Faure, however, is an able reader. He is the only one to correctly identify her as the culprit, recalling a particular look in her eyes where she looks particularly sorrowful. Faure, unlike the other men who attempt to read her body, is a good reader because he goes beyond the trappings of the corporeal, engaging with the emotions underpinning Fonkia's actions and indeed her symptoms. Rather than reveal his suspicions to the police, he deems her a victim of fatality, une victime de la fatalité, he says, and decides to find her himself. His concern is first and foremost for the well-being of his patient. An unnamed doctor had already visited her and deemed her beyond help. But Faure insists that, although we're not told how he does this, we are told that within a few days she is out of danger. So he manages to heal her because he understands her. Right? He even procures her a position as a washerwoman in Saint-Louis to get her out of this weird connection to these Russian aristocrats. However, Sand breaks with idealist tradition, at the end of this text. Fonkia does not live happily ever after, which is quite unusual for Sand. And a few months after her initial recovery, she dies of something completely unrelated, of consumption. Now, on the one hand, Fonkia's death seems to undermine my suggestion of Faure as a good reader. He was ultimately unable to save her. But recall that Mireille Bossis, as I mentioned at the beginning of this paper, has pointed out that Sand very, very rarely gives a name to any of the diseases that affect her protagonist. Aside from Lelia's cholera and some smallpox every now and again that affects some cows, there's not really any mention of named diseases. All of a sudden we get consumption. The fact that Sand chooses specificity on this occasion serves in no way to undermine her doctor. Between 1870 and 71, when Sand was writing this text, Paris saw a substantial increase in the number of deaths from tuberculosis, and despite concerted efforts made to combat the disease, by the end of the 19th century there was still no effective cure. Instead, I think perhaps we are encouraged to look not to Fonkia, but to her doctor. If, to return to the political allegory, Fonkia stands to represent the nation, Sand's point might well be that the nation cannot be saved without more individuals able to diagnose the country's root problems. Thanks to Faure's empathetic reading of Fonkia, however, the scene of her passing elicits in turn the sympathy of the reader. As she smiles at her doctor, even though she's on her death's door, she says she is contente, she's happy. And then she imagines that she can see her mother welcoming her in front of her. So, by way of conclusion, I want to suggest that we can see in Faure's practice a form of narrative medicine avant la lettre. The development of narrative medicine as a form of diagnostic practice presents a rethinking of what Michel Foucault has described as the medical gaze. This gaze, Foucault argues, emerged with a new medical discourse at the end of the 18th century and demanded a separation of the body of the patient from their personality, their identity, to effectively arrive at a diagnosis. While the objectivity the medical gaze affords might appear to reflect scientific principle, Rita Charon has argued that it in fact fails both patient and clinician alike. Turning to literature and processes of reading, Charon has argued that what medicine needs is an injection of empathy, proposing that literary interpretation reflects aspects of medical diagnosis, but requires the reader to inhabit the world of another. Applying such an empathetic act of interpretation to medicine would, Charon suggests, improve diagnostic processes by addressing issues with anxiety, fear, and shame on the part of the patient through the creation of a more genuine connection between them and the clinician. Thus conceived, Charon states, narrative medicine can help answer many of the urgent charges against medical practice and training, its impersonality, its fragmentation, its coldness, its self-interestedness, its lack of social conscience. Narrative medicine may be a modern development, but with the medical gaze as described by Foucault governing practice in the 19th century, I think there's a link that we can see between the medical gaze that Foucault recognises and the realist novel, which seeks a similarly dispassionate approach to the body. Son's texts frequently present a form of clinical practice that promotes such an approach. The Sondian doctor, in the form of four at least, functions therefore as a figural good reader. So the objective analysis contained within Foucault's proposition of the organical aligned with the realist desire to represent the world as it is pseudo-scientifically. But Brooks also informs us that the impetus behind narrative is desire, and desire to know and understand bodily experience. We can thereby consider the novel as a further facet of this medical gaze. Both medicine and literature emerge from a wider interest in bodily knowledge, each functioning as forms of interpretative reading. Indeed, it was in precisely these medical terms that Émile Zola, who I feel is going to come up constantly today, in 1876, penned an article that sounded the death knell of idealism. He published it, I think it was 5 days after Sand died. And he said, Sand is dead, her formule idéaliste, her idealist formula is over, and Balzac's realist formula is the only one that matters. Zola lauded Balzac's scientific, objective approach and compares him to an anatomist, while his primary complaint against Sand was that she attempted to intervene in the maladies of the age. Elle observe plutôt pour guérir que pour constater. Son continuel désir a été d'être guérisseur, un ouvrier du progrès, l'apôtre d'une nouvelle vie de béatitude. Such an analogy promotes an approach to representation as an impartial means of furthering understanding of the human condition. In Zola's conception, however, Sand's aesthetic has a pedagogical function and is engaged in correcting society's various maladies. Sand's long-standing association with idealism, which has been influentially restated recently by Naomi Shaw, seems in turn then to prevent consideration of Sand as a writer interested in the questions of her age. The title of guérisseur or healer implies, after all, a lack of formal medical training, which we already know Sand did actually have. If we consider Sand's doctors as readers, the medical model Sand promotes suggests that the ideal reader is not emotional per se, but emotionally intelligent, striking a fine balance between science and social conscience. While the value of Flaubert and Zola as writers engaged with scientific inquiry is well established, the importance of Sand's own scientific engagement tends to be confined to the natural world. Attending to the doctor-patient relationship in Sand's text, as this paper has done, offers a way of incorporating Sand into discussions of 19th century epistemology, revealing her sustained interest in perceptions and understandings of the body, and suggesting alternative ways of reading her own texts that go beyond these trappings of ideal or sentimental. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James, for that very interesting new perspective on Sand. I think there's a lot of interesting questions that might emerge from this. So our final speaker in this panel, forgive me, I'll try and pronounce your name.
Shima.
It's Shima Imci, is it?
Yes.
Okay, welcome. Shima is from Istanbul Sehir University, and today she will talk about Zola, but from the Turkish perspective, Ottoman Zola, limits of naturalism and social Darwinism in Turkish literature.
Sorry, I gave myself this as a PhD president last year, and I hope it is working. Yes, it is working. Thank you very much. I would like to begin by citing an author who is known as the first naturalist in Ottoman intelligentsia. Should we make youth read Lady of Camins or Zola's Nana? Of course, we should make them read Nana, since Nana is a text that reflects the results of sexual passion. I'm sorry for a dark start, but in February 1887, the writer of these words, Bishop Fuat, committed suicide. The suicide, however, was not an ordinary one. He cut his veins and started taking notes on his experience with the aim of writing the first experimental text in Turkish literature. Bishop Fuat was also the man who translated Claude Bernard's An Introduction to the Study of Experimental Medicine for a publishing house entitled Pocket Library that, I quote, printed concise essays for the general public. Indeed, at the height of the 19th century, while positivism and determinism functioned as tools to engineer a new Ottoman man who would be scientifically measurable and controllable, determinism and naturalism created major debates among intelligentsia. First of all, of course, there were the questions about whether humans' behaviors were affected by hereditary qualities. How did people make decisions? If biology was what mattered when it came to humans' behaviors, what did soul or spirit mean? For instance, in a publication entitled Vücud-ı Beşer, Human Body, in 1839, Şerafettin Maumi wrote, "The major controversy between materialism and spiritualism stems from the claim whether the cerebral activity is consisted of the soul or not. Refraining from engaging with this debate, I would say it is the brain which sees, hears, smells, and tastes." Not very surprisingly, all these discussions were echoed in debates on literature. What was the aim of literature? Could pieces of literature be scientific? Should the priority be aesthetics or them being didactic? In literary imagination, the clash between spirituality and materialism found its utmost representation in the debates on Émile Zola. The appropriation of Zola and how he was discussed as a literary figure, I argue, was directly connected to the discussion on the essence of the individual and the proper strategy for the appropriation of modernity. In this paper, I will first discuss the debates on determinism in the late 19th and early 20th century of the Ottoman Empire to give a picture of how the intelligentsia of the sick men of Europe approached the issue. I will then look at writers who joined the debates on determinism, naturalism, and Zola. The first one will be Beşir Fuat, who carried the flag of naturalism in Turkish literature, and thereby created a strong reaction from more conservative authors such as Ahmet Mithat, who gave interviews on the matter and eventually moved on to write novels that exemplified a more moral and aesthetic naturalism. Finally, I will discuss Halide Edip and argue that her novel, Mevlüt Hüküm, Promised Verdict, which was dedicated to the soul of Émile Zola, presents us a clear picture of why Zola became such a central figure in the late Ottoman Empire and what worries his works triggered in an empire on the way to its demise. 19th century was a century in which the Ottoman Empire went through fundamental changes in its policies and approach towards its subjects. This period was started by the declaration of an edict known as Tanzimat, meaning reformation. This edict also started what was later defined as the westernization movement of the Ottoman Empire. With these reforms, Muslim and non-Muslim subjects of the empire were given rights to life and property, and these rights were guaranteed protected by secular law, ensuring equality among all of its members. This way, the empire hoped to stop various groups under its rule from being influenced by nationalist movements. The change, however, was not only a legal one. Tanzimat Edict started a cultural transformation as much as a legal one. First, newspapers emerged in this period. A genre called novel was introduced to the public for the first time. Young male Ottomans were sent to Europe for education, mostly to France. Upon their return, a translation bureau was founded. These translators were also the authors of the first novels in Ottoman Turkish language. For the first time, there were public debates on the concepts of equality and liberty. Women's rights, too, eventually became part of the debates. The 19th century for the Ottoman Empire was a century in which a process called modernization began. And not surprisingly, in this very period, with the worries over declining military power, health institutions were centralized, with first medical schools and research centers opened up as part of military schools. The first state hospital was founded in 1806. Between 1829 and 1836, the population census and the registration of births and deaths were regulated. From 1827 onwards, the Ottoman Empire systematized its control over abortions with decrees that banned the act of or penalized those who assisted abortion. By the turn of the century, worries over syphilis had led to the publication of books, both in translation and originally written in Ottoman Turkish, to be distributed to warn the public about the dangers of disease, with writers such as Ahmet Mithat strongly arguing that full health checks should now be preconditions of marriages. In other words, worries over diseases developed alongside concerns regarding the structure and system of the Ottoman Empire, and novel as a literary form would therefore be born in the middle of these concerns. While the Ottoman state started to pay particular attention to the health of the population, medicine began to shape the discourse on the new Ottoman individual. Especially after the Tanzimat, medicine functioned as one of the most powerful agents of Turkish modernization and played essential in social and political transformations in the Ottoman Empire of the 19th century. As Serdar Poyraz writes, the discussion among the intellectuals of the late Ottoman and early Republican periods was not about modernity on the one hand versus tradition on the other. It was about the proper strategy for the appropriation of modernity in a non-European setting. Medicine functioned as one of the key areas where these new epistemological notions were introduced and applied. Buchner, Claude Bernard, and Darwin, among many others, were often cited to explain society in light of science and positivism. Infatuation with materialism and positivism led many Ottoman students, thinkers, and writers to act as social engineers. As the hereditary qualities of the population became a matter of concern, this discourse inevitably found its representation in works of literature from melodramas to national romances. In Learned Patriots Debating Science, State and Society in the 19th Century Ottoman Empire, Alper Yalçınkaya argues, starting from the second half of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire saw doctors as the new ideal type. Educated in Europe, these doctors would not just heal the patients with various diseases, but also their duties had become healing the society. While doctors' mission became healing the society, literature too took the job. For Beşir Fuat, literature was a tool to learn more about the ills of society, to make sure authors would cure these ills by educating the public. He praised and translated Émile Zola, Charles Dickens, Flaubert, Auguste Comte, Diderot, Claude Bernard, and Herbert Spencer, among many others. He published a monograph on Victor Hugo, in which he included a discussion on Hugo's criticism of Zola and Claude Bernard's experimentalism. In this discussion, Fuat criticizes Hugo's critique and sides with Zola and Bernard. For him, writing poetry and sentimentalist works was not worthy of praise, and what was beneficial for the whole society was writing realist and naturalist works that would reflect a reality that could be observed through 5 senses. His publication raised immense criticism with many other writings in other writers in response. Many others writing in response to his criticism towards what were considered to be the best examples of literature. But he full-heartedly continued to oppose the use of metaphors and hyperbole, and criticized sentimentalists for using the heart as the organ through which feelings and love were expressed or experienced, while science showed that it was the brain which directed the emotions. What should be the subject of a novel was another major debate topic among them. Zola received the biggest share of the critique here. Ahmet Mithat, for instance, condemned Zola for only writing about ugly and sick parts of society, and highlighted how bad this could be for the education of the readers. He was also critical of Zola's realism, since according to him, literature had to leave room for imagination. Beşir Fuat, on the other hand, was in support of the idea that a writer should first and foremost be a scientist and write only what could also be proved scientifically. Beşir Fuat's death did not put an end to the storm that his work on Victor Hugo had created. After his death, Ahmet Mithat, perhaps one of the biggest enemies of naturalism, published his own preferred version of a naturalist novel, Müşahedat, in 1890. Nebizade Nazım Efendi and Halit Ziya Işıklıgil were among the other prolific authors who attempted to write realist or naturalist novels, yet Zola remained as a point of discussion. To what extent were they willing to depict filth and filthy parts of society? Ahmet Mithat criticized Zola's subject materials in his essay called Emil Zola'yı neden okumuyorum? Why don't I read Emil Zola? In Malumat in 1896. In Ben Neyim, What Am I? Ahmet Mithat made his main opposition to Zola clearer. He was, after all, I quote, reducing the soul to a product of the body machine, unquote. Halit Ziya Işıklıgil was another name that was concerned about Zola's choice of subjects. For instance, he writes in his hikaye story, I quote, the Goncourts are also realists, but in spite of this, their work is not filthy. There is filth in Zola. Why? Unquote. Zola's novels and his understanding of naturalism worked as a dynamic and thought-provoking barrier for the novelists of the last quarter of the 19th century, one that would lead the way to positivist thought, but exceeding the barrier was regarded as highly dangerous, morally corrupt, and radical. In 1917, Hade, a prominent author of Turkish literature, published a novel entitled Meyve Tükum, The Promised Verdict. On the first page of the novel, there was a note that read, I quote, I dedicate this to the soul of Emil Zola, unquote. I would like to highlight the word soul here, because it was a word central to the debates and discussions on materialism versus religion in the Ottoman Empire. Many authors accused Determinism of reducing humans into animals by holding hereditary qualities responsible for humans' actions. Participating in the debates, the novel mediates between genres. While the first half of the novel follows the principles of Zola's experimental writing, the second half becomes an adaptation of the tragedy of Othello. The clash between materialism and spiritualism turns the novel into a naturalist tragedy. The dates on Halide's journal show that her fascination with Zola was a long-term one. Although Mevlütçük was written in 1917, the years 1901 and 1902 in her memoir are full of comments on her experience of reading the French writer, in which she defines him as, I quote, the most powerful educator of my soul, unquote. The word soul is repeated throughout her notes on Zola, which she places in opposition to selfish, materialist, and even worldly desires. According to Halide, the high ideals require one to dedicate one's life to the collective, which she sees as the only way to reach the truth. Her admiration of Zola, accordingly, stems from her regarding Zola as an idealist fighter of truth against the lower desires. Zola's soul, she writes, sense an invisible oppression created by the lower powers which dominate man and make him eager to suppress truth, unquote. Halide Edip's understanding of Zola is one where she combines his materialism with an idea of the divine. In her memoir, she notes, I quote, Zola lighted up portions of the human soul with his fastidious and very French idealism. He chastised man by making grotesque statues and pictures of their violence, unquote. Such sexual desire was accordingly stopping mankind from reaching a higher truth. I quote, Zola's soul sensed an invisible oppression created by the lower powers which dominate man and make him eager to suppress truth. The same argument about reaching a higher level is revealed more with her words, I quote, Zola evidently taught that the sexual perversions were fundamental ones in man's character, and that unless he were made sane and normal in that respect, he could not reach higher levels, unquote. What she means by higher level, however, does not have determinist connotations, but rather she points to a purification of the soul in order to unite with the divine power, I quote. Zola's test is the hardest test for sincere and piously inclined souls. But if they can come out of it whole, nothing afterward can change their belief in the existence of a divine power, unquote. What then was this test again? On that she uses a metaphor, which is also my favorite. I always identify Zola with a picture of Christ chasing the moneylenders from the temple. I do not remember whose the picture is, but in it, Christ has the unrelenting eyes of a destroyer, full of a holy horror, such horror as Pasteur would have had in his eyes if he had seen a tube of microbes of some terrible sort getting loose in a human dwelling. The analysis that follows traces Halide Edip's formulation of Zola and her combination of materialism and spirituality, and argues that such combination or uneasy axiom is achieved in her novel, Mevlütçük, through combining two genres that point to two different worldviews, naturalism and tragedy, and that such combination is the outcome of the clash between materialism and spirituality. The discourse on deterministic progression of society is both affirmed and undermined as the novel is transformed from a naturalist text to an altered adaptation of William Shakespeare's Othello. The heroine, Sarah, who suffers from a venereal disease and hereditary madness, does not die of her illness, but rather is killed by her doctor husband, Kazım Şinasi, who falsely believes that she is having an affair. Despite her poor hereditary qualities and venereal disease, Sarah still manages to rise above the filth with all her, I quote, gracefulness intact, unquote. Her husband, however, despite all his normative social stance as a doctor, whose mission becomes the healing of society, cannot manage to rise from the filth in his soul and kills his wife. The first half of the novel not only portrays a scientific mind in the image of the protagonist Kazım Şinasi, but also the implied narrator follows a scientific, purely observant style by not interfering in the story and allowing the doctor protagonist Kazım Şinasi to judge and measure the ills of society through his scientific knowledge. While Kazım Şinasi observes everybody around him with a scientific curiosity, he cannot recognize their motivations. Whereas the narrator never leaves any gaps in his authority. It focalizes on other characters' minds when Kazım fails to read them. In line with Zola's formulation of experimental novel, the narrative of Mevlütçük sets out an experiment. Even though it borrows its observatory attitude from its protagonist Kazım Şinasi, he is not the observer he thinks he is, but is instead the object of observation. He is portrayed as an objective and scientific mind without any social skills. He observes people's behaviors as if they are, I quote, microbes blending in glass cartridges, unquote. He is not, however, an active agent himself. The narrator assures us, I quote, even though he is a healthy man, a gentleman from birth, he chooses to observe the attraction between man and woman, not wanting to participate in such relationships. Since his imagination left him uninterested about the parts of humans apart from their flesh, blood, and bones. He neither spotted a desirable attraction, nor did he notice any detestable lie, treachery, or vanity in women, unquote. However, the real experiment, and hence the novel itself, begins when Kazım Şinasi leaves his laboratory and joins society as an active agent. This is the experiment the plot puts into action. Is it possible to remain objective and rational against one's own desires and in the midst of contingencies? On the one hand, Hayriye follows Zola's principles by creating an experiment. On the other, she moves beyond Zola by making Zola's experimental man the subject of her experiment. Following on Yalçınkaya's arguments, experimenting on Kazım Şinasi also means experimenting on the ideal Ottoman citizen. Throughout the plot, the diseases of society are discussed, with Kazım Şinasi performing his role as a healer of society. According to his observations, the progress of society is hindered since the upper classes lead spoiled and useless lives, the venereal diseases are spread by unfaithful husbands, and poor neighborhoods suffer from tuberculosis due to unhealthy living conditions. The judgmental position of the narrative, usually narrated through Kazım's eyes, is also in line with the medical discourse of the period, in which Ottoman neuropsychiatrists already begin to use degeneration as a defining term. In 1915, the first psychiatrist of the Ottoman Empire, Mazhar Osman, gave a lecture entitled Are Turks Degenerates?, in which he mentioned hereditary qualities as positive in determining the present and future of the society. In 1923, 5 years after the publication of Meyve Tüküm, another neuropsychiatrist, Hüseyin Kenan, wrote in his essay, Psychopaths, I quote, "We see it every day in the clinic in large numbers. For example, the son of a father with syphilis and the grandson of a syphilitic come down with dementia pariecox. Similarly, the son of an alcoholic and syphilitic father becomes a psychopath," unquote. Accordingly, the description of alcohol and nightlife as racial diseases is presented by Kazım in Meyve Tüküm through alcoholism. There was no power like family, occupation, or willpower to inhibit this addiction. This was a racial disease. The country was darkened and burned by this debauchery that was a nest to filter diseases that had rotten the race. An Anatolian boy who spent his entire life suffering from poverty would waste his modest fortune on cards in coffee houses or on rakı, while sons of pashas or young masters would waste all their money and health in Beyoğlu. But at the same time, women and children with their patient but dark eyes were silently spreading the poison and the disaster of debauchery diseases to the race, unquote. On the one hand, Meyve Tüküm diagnoses the ills in society. On the other hand, it questions the authority of the medical figures by revealing the personal ills of Kazım Şinasi. He devotes himself to the well-being of society until he too is struck by his inner discord in the form of a blind passion for Sarah, a woman who is a victim of degeneration. When he admits to himself that he loves her, the expressions and the imagery of the text moves from scientific to passionate, and the line that connects the two is syphilis. The narrator first notes, I quote, "Kazım accepted with a scientific certainty that he loved Sarah," unquote, which is followed by an objective list of proofs revealing the steps towards the occurrence of this love. Then he admits that the first real moment of love was when he first saw her in her bed with, I quote, "bloody red spots on her dangerous and poisonous face," unquote. His love for Sarah is the strongest when she interacts with filth. The deterministic characteristic of the novel is also evident in its title. Sarah, a syphilitic woman with madness in her hereditary line, asks Kazım Şinasi to kill her if he suspects that syphilis or madness makes her lose consciousness. Therefore, Meyve Tüküm, meaning promised verdict, not only points to the promise that Sarah forces Kazım to give, which is that if she goes mad like her mother, Kazım will kill her, it also points to the hereditary traits. Sarah, from the moment of her birth, is doomed. The madness of her mother marks her as one of the undesirables of society. She is not only born with a deficiency in her blood, she also passes these qualities to her own daughter. The plot puts these two opposite characters, Kazım and Sarah, together almost in an experimentalist attitude to observe the results of this union, which reveals the tension between spirituality and materialism. The second half of the novel, which depicts Kazım and Sarah's marriages, differs drastically from the first half. As Kazım's sexual desire for Sarah begins to cloud his scientific judgment more every day, he loses his dominant position in the narrative, and other characters' perspectives begin to share the narrative. In 1912, during the Balkan Wars, Kazım Şinasi decides to join the war to serve as a doctor. However, his time away is consumed by his blinding jealousy, which is fed by another character's constant hints at the relationship between Sarah and Sururi's doctor brother Kamil. While Kazım Şinasi loses his ideal position more every day, Sarah, on the other hand, saves herself from following the call of the flesh. When Sururi's brother suddenly appears in the plot, she resists the memories that Kamil's existence brings forth. Despite Kamil's love for her, she manages to loyally wait for Kazım's return and devotes herself to the well-being of the collective by nursing in a dispensary. Gradually, Sarah's soul proves to be purer than Kazım's. She rises spiritually despite her poor hereditary qualities, while Kazım Şinasi falls despite his ideal social stance. While early in the novel, the influence of Zola is evident, in the second half of the novel, the tragic nature gains pace as Kazım turns more and more into Othello, his uncontrollable desire taking charge. He treats the viruses in society, but he misses the viruses in his own soul. Halidev's choice of adapting a tragedy, Othello, in a naturalist light is a critical and important decision, as the mutual point of the two genres point to the transition from religion-based understanding of destiny and justice to a scientific one. The novel in the end fulfills the deterministic laws of nature via Sarah's death, while at the same time portraying the positivist mind's fall from grace. When Behie, fulfilling the role of Othello's Iago, sends Sarah's piece of hair and handkerchief as a proof of Sarah's disloyalty to Kazım Şinasi, Sarah does not die as a villain, but as a victim. With hair functioning as a proof of her feminine existence, Kazım Şinasi takes this as a sign of her hereditary madness and decides to kill her to save her from herself. Possessed by jealousy, he sentences her to death by rationalizing his decision through scientific thinking. And with an ending that will be familiar from Zola's Nana, in 1913, on the night when the people of the city are out celebrating the Young Turks' victory of taking the city of Edirne, Kazım Şinasi injects morphine into Sarah's blood. The uneasiness between determinism and spirituality turns naturalism into a tragedy. To conclude, moving from the argument on the debates on spiritualism and materialism, forming the main lines in the creation of the new ideal Ottoman man, I will argue that Zola occupied a central position in the literary expression of these debates. Negotiating with Zola's determinism, deciding on how much of it was acceptable and how much of it was not, functioned as a way of appropriating modernity in a non-European setting. Thank you very much.
Welcome back, everybody. Hope you haven't got into your post-lunch slump. I'm very pleased to be chairing our second panel on subjectivity. So we're going to begin with Damien Tani's paper. So Damien Tani's three main research interests are 19th century French poetry, especially Mallarmé and Baudelaire, representations of evil in 19th and 20th century French literature and thought, and the novelist Louis-Ferdinand Céline. His publications include The Poet in Society, Art, Consumerism and Politics in Mallarmé, Evil, A History in Modern French Literature and Thought, and the article Louis-Ferdinand Céline, Literary Genius or National Pariah, Defining Moral Parameters for Influential Cultural Figures, post Charlie Hebdo. It's a bit of a mouthful there. Damien is currently writing a biography of Celine to be published by Reaction Books, imminently.
Yeah, imminently to use everything.
And today his paper is entitled Louis Ferdinand Céline's Tragic Hero, Philippe Ignace Semmelweis.
Yeah, thank you, Philippa. Okay, so anachronistically, I've distributed a handout. It's quotations rather than pictures, I'm afraid. But so why Celine, why Semmelweis? Well, first of all, I just want to say a little bit, for those of you who don't know about Celine and his controversial reputation. He's a writer, Louis-Ferdinand Céline, he is a writer who is both famous and infamous. Famous for being the best 20th century French novelist alongside Proust, according to many, some may disagree, largely owing to his groundbreaking 1932 novel Voyage au bout de la nuit, Journey to the End of the Night, which revolutionized French language with its incorporation of spoken slang and its satirical, emotionally direct portrayal of war, colonialism, and capitalism, and war, principally the First World War. But he's also infamous for his unfortunate gravitation towards fascism from the late 30s onwards, including the publication of 3 anti-Semitic pamphlets, which led to his exile in 1944 and his subsequent imprisonment in Denmark. He was eventually partially rehabilitated in the early 50s, especially with the publication of 3 novels known as the German trilogy. That's D'un Château, L'Autre, Nord, and Rigaudin. And he died in 1961. So he remains a polemical, divisive author, especially in his native France, which still struggles to this day to deal with his cultural legacy. And it's to the extent that, you know, there are almost 2 camps in France, the pro and the anti-Céline's, and with only a few in between. The Celine paradox can perhaps best be summarized by a quotation from the late novelist Philip Roth, who, as a Jew, greatly admired Celine the writer, but understandably repudiated his anti-Semitism. This quotation 1. To tell you the truth, in France, my Proust is Celine. There's a very great writer, even if his anti-Semitism made him an abject, intolerable person. To read him, I have to suspend my Jewish conscience, but I do it because anti-Semitism isn't at the heart of his books. Even Castle to Castle, that's the novel he published in 1957. Celine is a great liberator, I feel called by his voice. Okay, now Roth was by no means the only author influenced by him. There were Beats, there were Henry Miller, just to name the Americans, Vonnegut, etc. Now, today I'm being a bit of a coward. I'm slightly sidestepping the minefield of Celine's reputation, or rather I'm approaching it indirectly, if you like, from left field, via a lesser-known text. That is his 1924 medical thesis on the Hungarian 19th century doctor Philipp Ignaz Semmelweis. Okay, so it's worth pointing out at this stage that Celine actually trained to be a doctor, and that was his profession before he became a writer. So why this work? Well, first because it provides an idiosyncratic but valuable reminder of an important scientific discovery by a relatively forgotten medical figure. Semmelweis, as I said, was a Hungarian doctor who in 1847 discovered the cause of puerperal fever, or septicemia of the uterus, a deadly infection which killed thousands of young mothers throughout Europe at this time. Okay, and these deaths could not be explained. Okay, he was in the maternity wards throughout the hospitals of all European capitals. He eventually deduced that mortality rates from puerperal fever were significantly higher among those young mothers treated by doctors who had just performed autopsies without washing their hands. Now, to us nowadays, this seems completely ludicrous and insane, but we need to remember that this was several decades before Pasteur's discovery of microbes as the cause of infection. Despite his repeated warnings that doctors should be far stricter with their hygiene, by insisting, for example, that they wash their hands before delivering babies, he was ostracized by the medical community, ending up in a lunatic asylum and died prematurely, probably from meningitis derived from an infected cut. He was eventually rehabilitated, notably by eminent gynecologist Adolphe Pinard in 1906. Okay, but when Celine wrote about him in 1924, he was still relatively unknown. Now, secondly, the reason why Semmelweis is important is because it sheds valuable light on Celine's fiction and reputation. Because he can be read as a kind of alter ego to the novelist, insofar as his status as tragic hero uncannily anticipates the French author's own rise and fall from doctor to successful writer and then to social pariah. So in the first part of this paper, I want to argue that Semmelweis initially appealed to Celine as a socially conscientious medical role model. This was at a time, the early 1920s, when Celine, then known by his real name, Louis Destouches, was an ambitious, budding young doctor who was keen to devote his medical career to helping the poor and disadvantaged. And this is, in a sense, before he went over to the dark side, so to speak, politically. Before becoming a famous writer in 1932, by which time he had adopted the pseudonym Louis Ferdinand Céline, based on his maternal grandmother's maiden name, Céline Guillot. He had spent the 1920s working extensively in public health and social hygiene. Between 1924 and 1928, he held a prestigious post in the hygiene section of the newly formed League of Nations. which included evaluating health conditions in the Ford car factories in Detroit, okay, at the height of Ford's success, and setting up a public hygiene bureau in both Africa and Latin America. And this is an often forgotten fact about Celine, that he did work for the League of Nations and held this quite prestigious post. But from 28 onwards, between 28 and 32, he had become somewhat disillusioned by the internal politics of the League. So he moved to a far more hands-on role as a GP in a modest medical practice in the rundown Parisian banlieue of Clichy. This, by the way, becomes, in his famous novel Voyage au bout de la nuit, Rancy-la-Garenne, okay, which is a kind of fictionalized, semi-fictionalized version of Clichy. The word Rancy, meaning rancid, there's a wordplay there, which is indicative of his dark humour, his satire. He, nevertheless, from 28, continued to undertake individual missions on behalf of the League to European capitals in order to explore the methods and conditions of medical practices in the poorest areas. His aim was to come up with an affordable, standardised form of public health care that was accessible to all. So there was a genuine commitment on Celine's part, particularly at that time, to affordable healthcare for all and to, in a sense, helping the underdog of society, which of course doesn't excuse his later positions. Now, this image of the humble GP tirelessly tending to his patients in the poorest sections of society, an image that broadly has its basis in fact, was actively exploited by his shrewd Belgian publisher Robert Denoël as part of the publicity campaign for his first novel, Journey to the End of the Night. We need to remember that at this point Celine was a complete unknown, okay? He was just a doctor, not known at all in literary circles. The fact that the novel's narrator, a kind of alter ego of Celine, Ferdinand Bardamu, also treats poor and destitute patients in the downtrodden banlieue of La Garenne-Rancy, lent weight to Denoël's strategy. But in the second part of the paper, I'll argue that in 1936, a significant shift occurs with regard to Celine's attitude towards Semmelweis. A shift that was largely a response, it seems to me, to the unexpectedly negative reception of his second novel, Mort à Crédit, or Death on Credit, which has since been heralded as a classic, but at the time really, divided opinion. So Celine, once again, with the backing of his publisher Denoël, essentially reappropriated his biography of Semmelweis to refashion his public image in a far more defensive way, as opposed to the proactive way for publicising Voyage. Semmelweis was no longer an inspirational figure, but a cautionary one. This is because his medical exploits at this point in Celine's career became overshadowed in his mind by his status as wronged victim, status that resonated with his own growing feelings of persecution by a public who had turned against him. And this, by the way, was just before he published Bagatelle pour un massacre, his first anti-Semitic pamphlet, but clearly once he published that and his anti-communist pamphlet Mea Culpa, then he really became persona non grata for many. And the link between Semmelweis and Celine's feelings of persecution is reflected in his decision to republish his thesis, the biography of Semmelweis, in 1936, that very year, alongside his anti-communist pamphlet, Mea Culpa. So Celine's double use of his Semmelweis biography, as first a sort of proactive and then a defensive move, can be traced back to three interconnected religious, scientific, and literary tropes that run through the text itself. Firstly, there's the hagiographical discourse. I asked Larry and Stephen how to pronounce this word, and none of us could agree, so I'm going with that. Of the saint as the médecin des pauvres, the doctor of the poor. Secondly, there's the late 19th century realist and naturalist discourse of the doctor as social investigator and discoverer of the truth. Which I think resonates a little bit with the papers this morning. And thirdly, the early 19th century trope of the solitary, tragic, romantic hero with an artistic sensibility. So I want to start with the first of these, the hagiographical discourse. Philippe Roussin has shown how both Celine's biography of Semmelweis and the marketing campaign of Journey to the End of the Night invoke the same religious discourse. Both follow the hagiographical model of the médecin des pauvres, The Doctor of the Poor, which recalls the vita or life of the saint as a martyred figure who devotes his life to curing the sick. Recalling the thesis advanced in the mid-20s by Bernard Grothusen in Origine de l'esprit bourgeois en France, Jean-Claude Bournet lamented that ever since the Enlightenment in France, there has been a tendency for her to celebrate her bourgeois men and women of letters as secular heroes. But the problem with this secularizing discourse is that it reinforces the existence of an intellectual urban elite that is largely disconnected from the ordinary working person. By constructing the image of the autodidact jobbing medical doctor, discovered by chance in the banlieue of Clichy, and unsullied by contact with the elitist networks of knowledge and culture found in Paris, Celine, still then known as Dr. Destouches, therefore revives this hagiographical discourse associated with the innocent simplicity and humility of religious figures such as Francis of Assisi. Now, I'm not seeking to reinterpret Celine as a paradigm of moral virtue, which it clearly isn't. I'm just relating into a discourse that, pre-existing discourse and the way in which it's presented in Semmelweis. In this regard, poverty, innocence, and lack of formal education are valorized as marks of simplicity that recall Christ's special bond with the poor. And it's worth noting that Celine himself did not belong to the kind of middle-class French intellectual elite. He saw himself very much as an outsider. He came from a lower middle-class background. He didn't pursue his lycée education beyond the age of about 14. So this is why, with Celine's consent, de Noël, his publisher, cultivated the public image of this humble doctor first, author second, rather than the other way around. In other words, he was promoted as a reluctant author who wrote under the pseudonym of Celine because his main vocation was not that of writer, but of doctor, whose principal focus was to tend to his patients in his modest, downtrodden suburb. However, this image of the publicity-shy doctor as author was predicated on a kind of clever form of reverse psychology. It created a mystique around Celine that increased rather than decreased the curiosity of journalists and public alike. And the interviews that followed the publication of Voyage, and both preceded and followed his winning of the literary Renaudot Prize in 1932, reveal a Celine whose, to quote Roussin, medical identity, far from disappearing into the world of literature, was on the contrary claimed and reaffirmed by him. So between December 1932 and April 1933, Celine regularly chose to be interviewed and photographed at his dispensary in Clichy, in his hospital white, surrounded by his colleagues. And that Celine's identity as doctor was deliberately promoted and controlled is further attested by the fact that his letter to Lucien Descaves, one of the key members and supporters of the jury for the Goncourt Prize, which Celine controversially didn't win, was written on official headed letter paper from his clinic. And there were, I've looked at there were all manner of newspaper headings saying such things as Céline en blouse blanche, so Celine in a white coat, or diagnostic littéraire, literary diagnosis, so the wordplay on diagnosis. So this image of the self-effacing humble doctor employed in 1932 and 1933 by de Noël as a marketing strategy is very similar in tone to Celine's depiction of the selfless martyr in Semmelweis, who wishes to avoid controversy and is purely driven by a sense of moral duty. And that's quotation 2. Destiny chose me to be a missionary of truth as to the means that must be taken to avoid and to combat the perpetual scourge, etc. The fight against disease is also presented in religious terms as a kind of Manichaean battle between good and evil, in which the innocent purity of the human body must be protected from the contaminating evil of disease. Semmelweis' social conscience and desire to treat the poor, something with which Celine strongly identified, is reflected in his distress at the sight of young mothers who are pregnant out of wedlock and yet still come to the wards out of desperation as they have no other choice. So this is the 19th century, you need to remember. Quotation 3, into Klein's wards, that's one of Semmelweis' medical colleagues, in short, went only those stricken suddenly, without a penny, without security, lacking even a supporting arm to warn them against the dangers of that terrible place. And it's worth noting in passing that in the novel Voyage, there's an episode in which Bardem, the principal character, who's also a doctor, treats an unmarried mother for a botched abortion. Okay, so you can see the link between the biography, the novel, and Semmelweis. So Semmelweis's compassion for the underdog, his selfless humility, recall the hagiography of each of the same. But the biography by Celine also invokes, albeit more by way of counterpoint, a second trope. And that is the scientific discourse of late 19th century realism, naturalism, that legitimizes the doctor as an objectively reliable social investigator who is uniquely qualified to uncover the truth, or vérité, and the word crops up frequently in the Semmelweis text. Now, Zola's Dr. Pascal can be seen as the obvious prototype of this model in his coherent ability to present an ordered, meaningful world and to recognize and organize symptoms as signs of a reality that could be charted and described. But Semmelweis is both similar and different to Dr. Pascal. Similar in that he too leaves no stone unturned in his pursuit of vérité, the truth, but different in that this pursuit of the truth is not purely scientifically driven. It's not just the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, as it is principally for Zola's doctor, but a moral mission to reveal the truth in the face of those doctors who seek to hide it purely in order to preserve their honours and titles. As that's quotation 4. It became a game of skill to explain death by thickened pus, benign pus, or laudable pus. Basically, a fatalism in fancy words, the brain of the impotent. So in other words, the doctors didn't know the cause of deaths from venereal fever, so they just invented medical reasons to legitimize their ignorance. But there's a second difference, it seems to me, between Semmelweis and Zola's Pascal. Aside from having to deal with the resistance of his fellow doctors, his medical vocation is driven less by logic or the scientific method than emotion, compassion, enthusiasm, and impulsiveness. So I'll just read the first part of this quote to save time. These sublime ascents towards the realm of the great, precise truths proceeded almost uniquely from an enthusiasm far more poetic than the rigour of experimental methods, which is generally given as their sole genesis. Man is a creature of feeling. There are no great creations outside the realm of emotion, and enthusiasm rapidly dries up amongst the majority of men in proportion as they wander from their dream. So these are the attributes and lexical field of romanticism rather than scientific positivism. Emotion is privilege over reason, and enthusiasm or fervour over clinical detachment. And this is why the prototype of the tragic romantic hero, which also recalls the characters of the early 19th century French author Chateaubriand, is the strongest of the three cultural models that Celine invokes in his depiction of Semmelweis. The tragic romantic hero overlaps to some extent, it is true, with the martyr figure of the Doctor of the Poor, the hagiographical discourse, in that both are compassionate figures who suffer in isolation and battle against the odds. But the key difference between the two is that the romantic hero perceives the world through a fine-tuned aesthetic sensibility, which is emphasized by Celine in his description of Semmelweis's upbringing. From the very outset of the text, he's presented as the child of Romanticism. Born of the ashes of Napoleonic defeat, he was born in 1818, so 3 years after Waterloo. This period is presented in pathological terms as one of convalescence. His aesthetic sensibility and gravitation towards beauty is shown by the fact that he immerses himself in the music of street singers. That's quotation 6. It was songs and not school that this little Semmelweis of ours adored. Temptation loomed large for him on all sides. Here, his artistic impulses merge with the saint's empathy for the poor. The guitar player to whom Semmelweis listens is a man of the street, a man of the people. And it's worth noting, in another biographical parallel between Celine and Semmelweis, that Celine himself grew up in a place called the Passage Choiseul near the Opéra district in Paris, which is a place not just known for the opera in the building itself, in the Garnier Palace, but also for more popular culture like the opérette, popular song and cabaret. Okay, so these are regular forms of entertainment to which Celine himself was exposed as a child. So I want to conclude by suggesting that the third of the three strands discussed thus far, the romantic as opposed to the hagiographical and the scientific, has the greatest personal resonance for Celine, especially because it foreshadows his feelings of persecution in his later career when he considered himself to be increasingly marginalized and ill-treated. Whether or not we agree with this is beside the point. Celine considered himself to be persecuted, okay? His depiction of Semmelweis as the tragic romantic hero uncannily anticipates the tone of his defiant and self-pitying letters written from 1936 onwards, and even more so when he fled to Denmark in exile in 44 and 45, his reputation having been discredited for his associations with fascism and anti-Semitism. So he says in quotation 7, "What do you risk by appealing for my murder? A short spell in prison. That's all." These are rather loose rush translations, by the way. "Since I don't belong to any party or clique, any church, that I'm practically all alone." And then further down he says, "I'm even an invalid, radial paralysis, sclerosis of the middle and inner ear, military medal since 12th of November, so by no means a youngster." So the plaintive, defiant tone in which he positions himself as solitary wrong victim who does not belong to any accepted community, and it is no coincidence that Chateaubriand was one of his favourite authors, a romantic author who wrote, or pre-romantic author who wrote about solitude and not belonging. And he also draws attention to the fact that he's an invalid, a mutivier de guerre, a war invalid who was badly injured in the trenches while serving his country, which is true. Now, we can compare this quotation, this letter, first to Semmelweis' own ostracization by his fellow doctors, and secondly to his pitiful descent into madness and the severe deterioration of his physical health, eventually resulting in his death at the age of 47. That's quotation 8. Lymphangitis, peritonitis, pleurisy. When the turn came for meningitis, he began to babble a sort of endless verbal stream, an interminable reminiscence, in the course of which his broken head seemed to empty itself in long dead phrases. So once again, the emphasis on physical decay, on victimization, and isolation. I just want to conclude with an extract from a letter by Celine to his wife in 46, when he was in prison in Denmark and arguably at his lowest ebb, the most depressed he had been since the war when he was injured. He says, quotation 9, "I am the persecuted one. I persecuted no one. This is a bitter truth pill to swallow. I won't labour the point. I'm not looking to convince anyone beyond my own pitiful state." And just further on, he says that my case is not a hideous exception. On the contrary, this is a common occurrence throughout the course of French history. The persecution of the writer has always been a national sport in France, okay? The persecution of the writer. And he quotes a whole bunch of writers, Villon, Rabelais, and so forth, who are forced to flee from French justice for more or less their entire lives for one reason or another. Reasons are always found to persecute the French writer. So, here, just to conclude, we can note not only Celine's plea for innocence. He says he's wrongly being condemned for what he wrote before the Second World War, okay, and his persecution complex, which he clearly suffered from, but the fact that he situates himself in a long lineage and tradition of unjustly persecuted French writers. It is as if he remobilizes the prototype of Semmelweis' tragic romantic hero to refashion his public image as that of wronged writer. So here the logic of Doctor first and Writer second that was used to promote his first book as Doctor of the Poor and Médecin des Pauvres has been reversed. Now it is Writer first and foremost, no mention of the Doctor, because by staking a claim to his literary credentials, he finds firmer ground in which to legitimize his feeling of victimhood. So Semmelweis, therefore, emerges both as an important text in its own right and a kind of odd text that sheds light on Celine's controversial life and reputation. Thank you. Sorry, it was a bit long.
Thanks very much, Damien. I think we're going to take questions at the end. Yeah, so we'll now move on to Cara. So Cara Wells is a senior lecturer in Spanish Studies in the School of Modern Languages at the University of Bristol, and is currently working on a monograph on masculinity and mental health during the early years in the Francoist dictatorship. She has published widely on post-war Spanish fiction and culture, women's writing, and European literature. Her very recent monograph focuses on the concept of psychological and bodily relief in the novels of Carmen Laforet, the novels of Carmen Laforet and Aesthetics of Relief. And today we're going to be talking about the anxious male body in post-war Spanish culture.
Thank you. And thanks to Kit again for organising this. So I did have a lovely slide, but I left my laptop, series of slides, but I left my laptop at home, thinking I didn't want to bring a lot of stuff to London, not really realising my key drive was in it. But I have got paper and I have got some visual images. So my book that just came out in April really started me on this new project, which I've been working on for about a year and a half. And I was interested in this particular writer, Carmen Laforet's representation of relief, psychological relief and bodily relief, which has never been looked at in through the perspective of literature. And in fact, relief as a concept has not been really examined in any significant depth. So I started looking at her representations of the male body in her fiction and became interested in the way that her novels were examining the male body, states of anxiety, states of distress. But I'm not working on Carmen Laforet anymore because the ref didn't allow me that, so I've got new material I'm working on, and today I'm going to look at two films. They're not particularly well known, although one of the directors became very well known nationally and internationally. So we're going back to Spain, but moving on from Catherine's period, I'm going to be looking at representations of the anxious male body in the two films from the 1950s. One is Juan Antonio Bardem's film called Calle Mayor. I'll refer to it as Main Street, which was screened in 1956, was subjected to an awful lot of cuts because censorship existed. And then the second one is Carlos Saura's Los Golfos, or it was translated as The Delinquents. It's available as a DVD, but with French subtitles. And that was produced in 1959, but it wasn't actually screened until 1962. It was banned 4 times in a row because it was depicting a kind of very negative representation of Francoist Spain. So my view is that films and literature from the 1940s and 50s, which remember Spain is a dictatorship from 1939 right up until 1975. So a long period of dictatorship, and censorship existed throughout that period. These films, these texts are still of immense value to academic research on Francoism. Even though these texts are not really being studied anymore within undergraduate curricula, which is quite sad for me because it's my area of research. So I think these texts provide us with really powerful insights into the ideological weaknesses within Francoism, and they help us better to deconstruct the idea of the dictator's monolithic hold on the country. There's that idea that Franco repressed everything and there was no room for kind of political dissent, cultural dissent. Well, you know, that's just not true at all. So personally, I'll talk briefly about the importance of methodology and sources when it comes to studying male emotion and specifically male neurosis. One of the idiosyncratic features of this area of research is the paucity of historical sources that provide detailed accounts of men's emotional responses to the reinvigorated patriarchal gender roles under Franco. There's much greater evidence of how women felt about their kind of return to the domestic sphere under Francoism. Testimonial accounts of men's emotional states, especially negative psychological states, remain few and far between. There are some studies of men suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder because of the Spanish Civil War, and also some writers have left memoirs of what it was like to live under Francoism. As Mark McHale has observed more generally, the history of male neurosis is, quote, the story of repeated and ritualized silences. And he also notes the pervasive silence surrounding male neurosis within medical discourse. And this was something we were talking about over lunch, how male depression, male neurosis is often framed within medical discourse in terms that, in a way, ameliorate it and certainly move it away from hysteria. But his work is very good. His 2008 study, Hysterical Men, is fantastic, and then also his 1995 study, Approaching Hysteria. But what Miquel picks up on is that if you want to really understand where male emotion is expressed, let's turn to literature. And obviously he quotes a lot of history from Lear, Shakespeare's Lear, to Cervantes' Don Quixote. He says that in these texts we can find evidence of nervous degenerates and states of male depression, states of male anxiety, states of illness. So as ever, as I'm a great champion of literature, let's go to the novel and find out what the novel tells us, because actually literature sometimes tells us more than the medical discourses. And Pierre Bayard has actually written a fantastic essay on this. He says, what can literature teach us about psychoanalysis rather than the other way around, which of course I would agree with. So my aim today is to suggest that the hypermasculine culture espoused by the regime was subjected to scrutiny across a range of texts, cultural texts, and that this process begins almost as soon as Franco comes to power in 1939. In other words, the idea that there were no accounts of male neurosis and no accounts of male anxiety or psychological, pathological issues is, it's a myth. They're present. And one early example of this is a novel by the Nobel Prize winner Camilo José Cela, The Family of Pascual Duarte, or Pascual Duarte's Family, which appears in 1942. And that's really a novel in which you can read his violence as an example of issues that he has had with a violent mother. So it's really to do with object relations theory. In fact, I don't think it's got anything to do really with the Spanish Civil War. So what we get in these texts is a depleted masculinity, kind of evidence of men who are not, in fact, very well. So what we get are pockets of resistance to so-called hegemonic masculinity. And to borrow from Kaja Silverman's interpretation of cultural subversion, what we get are challenges throughout the 40s, throughout the 50s, throughout the 60s. Despite this being a dictatorship, we get challenges to what Silverman describes as the dominant fiction idea. We have repeated references to male emotion. We've repeated depictions of the anxious male body. And all of these, in my view, signal really serious fractures within the ideology of Francoism. It was never cohesive. It was never coherent. It was never really that dominant. And yet we still believe that Franco was this dictator who kept everything well under wraps. But let's just dwell briefly on how men were supposed to forge their identities within the context of Francoist ideology. Models of militaristic behaviour based on an allegiance to a set of identifications with traditional male historical figures were used to mould young male children, young male adults into a cohesive patriotic group to uphold la patria, the fatherland, and maintain the power base of Francoism. And the most famous psychiatrist of the Franco era, he was a really despicable character called Antonio Vallejo Nagara. I would have shown you a picture of him, but he's quite scary, so I probably saved you that. He propagated this concept of men finding their yo ideal, their ideal self, which is a kind of complete inversion of what Freud was talking about. But so you would find your ideal self not through an individual relationship with yourself, insofar as we have a self, referencing Lacan, but instead you would find yourself through a mythical embodiment of a man. Heroes that were kind of used in Spanish history, what Vallejo Nagara described as varones de Castilla, men of Castile. However, These film directors that I'm looking at, Bardem and Saura, attempted to insert a variety of representations of masculinity into their films. Yes, there are these kind of hyper-masculine men, but there are also depictions of anxious, depressed, psychologically unstable men in these films, which completely invert or subvert this concept of the yo ideal, these mythologized men from Spanish history. So you see how the kind of mask drops, the hypermasculine mask drops in these films, and what you actually see is the real self of these men issuing forth in these films. One of the interesting things that I've noticed in both of these films, in Main Street and in The Delinquents, is the use of the male group. It's startling actually how both of these films rely on the male group, and I have these lovely slides from the film, but sorry, they're not here, they're back in Bristol, of lots and lots of screenshots of men in groups, and they're like they're almost like kind of gangs. I mean, in Los Golfos, it is a gang, it's a criminal gang, but in the other film, in Main Street, it's middle class. Their identities are performed through their allegiance to the group. The clothing is also very similar in these films, but they are from different classes, as I said. But both depict men whose psychological lives are underdeveloped, primarily as a result of their adherence to the group, in which male emotion is subsumed within displays of violence or other forms of aggressive behaviour. Now, there is an exception in Main Street, and that's available on YouTube. I'm going to show you a clip in a little while. There is an exception. There is a man called Federico, and he represents a centred, empathic male who defies this psychologically limiting behaviour of the group. However, as viewers, we gain a sense of the over-performance of men's identities through their loudness, through their gestures, male bravado, and also, as I said, through often repeated displays of violence. And I was struck, in fact, by both directors overemphasising in great detail the behaviour of the male group to such an extent that I started to understand that actually both Saura and Bardem are using the group as a form of social critique. And since censorship limited any form of direct critique in Francoist society, film producers had to rely on very subtle means. But actually, when you watch these films, the critique is really not that subtle. So despite major cuts to Main Street and The Delinquents, it was banned, as I said, 4 times, they both established a very strong critique of the impact of an absence of individual identity on the male psyche, which has ramifications beyond the time and place of Francoism. Parallels can also be drawn with other European dictatorships, particularly Hitler's Germany. And the work of Christina Weiland helps us better understand the intersections between fascist ideology and the formation or imposition of a homogenized identity within the male population. In 2015, she published a book called The Fascist State of Mind and the Manufacturing of Masculinity, which is really a really interesting study. What Weiland does is she draws on Hannah Arendt's description of totalitarianism. Weiland discusses fascism as, quote, a regime dominated by a passion for total domination and annihilation of individuality and difference, which amounts to total self-destruction, end quote. So Franco had distanced himself from a very kind of pro-fascist ideology by the 1950s, but there were still traits of it left, and some work I'm doing on a paper at the moment looks at the representation in some graphic novels which are collected under the title Pathological, of children who were forced to live in these communities, these homes, run, in fact, by members of the Spanish Falange, which was the kind of fascist wing of the regime. And in these, I don't normally look at graphic novels, it's a kind of new area for me, but if you look at this series of it's quite harrowing actually looking at them, you can only read kind of one at a time. If you look at these, the depictions of the faces, you can see how these young boys in these homes were actually forced to kind of adopt a collective identity, and they weren't really allowed to have an individual identity. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about the body. The body in these films and in other films becomes the site of this conflict between hypermasculinity and individual emotion. You often get very close-up shots of facial expressions, and the men's faces are often either blank or increasingly harrowed and kind of looking very, very anxious. As I said, you need to kind of focus on their gait. Are they standing? Are they sitting? Are they in a group? Are they filmed on their own? Why are there constant displays of or outbursts of violence? And in Main Street, what you actually witness is the male protagonist's final collapse into kind of mental despair, and he contemplates suicide at the end of the film. So just in relation to their distinctive plots, Main Street, Calle Mayor focuses on a group of men in their 30s, and what is striking is how childish they are. They're all professionals, they work in banks, some are doctors, but they have not grown up, they have not psychologically developed, they haven't grown, they haven't individuated, if you like, using Jung's term. And what they do, the plot of the film is very simple. They force one of the group to play a joke on a spinster, a woman who's also in her 30s, who remains unmarried. And Juan is forced to make her believe that he loves her, and eventually asks her to marry him. And then it's all going to be revealed as a joke. And this is a kind of entertainment for this small town group of men. But it's quite distressing because she fully falls for this, and at the end it is revealed to her that it's all a joke, and it's kind of really, obviously it's very devastating for her. The other film, The Delinquents, Los Golfos, is about a working class group of men who force again, or they don't really force, but they kind of support one member of the group to become a bullfighter. And the final scene, I'll show you the final clip, is of him finally entering the ring, and then the complete collapse of his male identity, of his masculinity, in front of this bull. And I think what these films show is that in place of this hypermasculine ideology, what we get actually is an anxious male body, an anxious emotional male body coming through, and often it's represented through the lack of speech, no dialogue, and just facial expressions. Now, we did get this working, so I hope it does work. So this first one should be...
I think it's the next, it's that one.
Yeah. So Juan realizes that the joke is going to be revealed to the woman, whose name I'm just Isabel, and this is a depiction of him on his own. So he's not part of the male group, and if you just focus on his face, you see he doesn't say anything, there's no dialogue whatsoever, he's looking disheveled. This is after his suicide attempt. He hasn't committed suicide, he stays out all night. actual last image of him. Now, I've managed to get hold of the uncensored script, and in the uncensored script, that is not the last image of him. Actually, he goes and finds Isabel and tells her he really does love her and wants to be with her, and she rejects him. So it's radically changed in order to make it palatable for this kind of hegemonic masculinity to be reasserted, because we presume from the film version, the censored film version, he's going to go back to the group and they're going to carry on playing their rather puerile games. But I think that's just interesting, and so the final image in the film is of him in a state of despair, but then actually Isabel is, at the end of the film, Isabel is presented as the victim. But in the original film script, she actually comes on defiant by saying, I don't want to marry you. She rejects him. So it's all twisted at the end. Okay, so I'll just do two more minutes. This second clip from The Delinquents is rather grotesque, I'm afraid, so I'm just warning you. It is of a bullfight, and it's Juan who has entered the ring. He looks kind of very hyper-masculine. He's a matador, he's got the full suit on, but this does actually show you a bull being killed. Was it this one?
No, it was yes.
It was that one.
Perhaps it might be the file sign actually.
What did we click on here before?
This window. Let's go into the file section.
Did I just...
Use it? Yes, you should.
Oh, sorry.
Just click the maximise. Yeah.
Give it to him. Come on, bro. One.
So this is the final scene. Juan is in the bull ring and he has to kill the bull. And he's performing all the typical moves of a matador, but it's a real performance. And then the crowd start jeering at him because he's doing so badly. And you can see him becoming more emotional. He puts his head in his hands, and it's a real collapse of his identity. So what we see again is this alternative masculinity. We see a man kind of stripped of this hypermasculinity of the Franco regime. Maybe we don't. So I'm just going to fast forward a bit. It's really quite harrowing again watching it. He starts off very well, the crowd support him, his friends are there from this gang, but the police are there as well because the police are going to arrest them at the end of the bullfight. And increasingly, the crowd start telling him he's basically failing. It's quite horrible when they kind of stab the bull to make it angry. I just want to show you this one shot of his face. That's the police entering. Okay, so from here on in, it is not looking good for him.
Aprende a corear, chalao, mamaracho.
So the crowd increasingly are turning against him. He tries to kind of increase his performance. And then he drops the cake.
Sácalo. Sácalo tú.
He does kill the bull. They just start jeering him. And the bull dies. You see it dying. It's rather awful. And there he goes with his head in his hands. It's been an absolute disaster for him. But I think that the symbol of the bull there, the dead bull, and of course it's all bound up, bullfighting is all bound up with masculinity in Spain. This has a long history, but I think the dying bull really serves as a wider metaphor, the death or slow demise of masculinity, not just Juan's masculinity, but masculinity in Spain. Juan's display of helplessness, the shots of him holding his head in his hands illustrate the breaking through of his emotions and signal the failings of Francoist masculinity. And perhaps, following on from something that Weiland had said, the beginnings of the deconstruction of one of the regime's central pillars. The bull's body symbolises not the triumph of man over animal, but the defeated corpse of a hypermasculine culture. And I think both films represent the anxious male body and psyche as a place where ideology intersects with emotion, where the group body subsumes the individual within a culture that negates the self and its will to be an individual body. Here we might say that a collective structure of unfeeling, to invert Raymond Williams's expression, formed the undercurrent of Francoism as the ideological demands of the regime produced a collective malaise of repressed male emotion and psychological alienation from the self. And this is represented in films and novels of the period through this depiction of a very anxious male body and a very anxious male psyche. Thanks. Sorry I didn't keep to time. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
I don't want to look at death bull for the rest of the time, do you?
So last in our panel is Françoise Campbell. Françoise Campbell is currently based here at the IMLR as a visiting fellow, where she's preparing her postdoctoral project on subjectivity and ambivalence in contemporary French novels. Françoise has recently completed her PhD on the ambivalence of utopia in the novels of Michel Houellebecq through a co-tutel programme, which sounds pretty brilliant, between the University of Melbourne and l'Université Paris 7 Diderot. Françoise has published articles in both French and English on utopia, ethics and subjectivity in Houellebecq's novels. And she's currently editing, or co-editing, a special issue of French cultural studies on transgression in Houellebecq's So today her title is Doubling, Dissection and Discontinuity, the Transhuman Subject and Bodily Decay in Marie Darrieussecq's Notre Vie dans les Forêts.
Thank you. Okay, so just to let you know beforehand, as this book hasn't been translated into English yet, the quotes that I'll be reading out during the course of my presentation will be in the original French, and what you'll see on the slides are my rough translations of those quotes. Okay, the theme of bodily transformation can be traced throughout the works of contemporary French novelist Marie Darrieussecq. From her 1996 novel Naturalism, in which she depicts her protagonist's metamorphosis into the body of a pig, to her 2005 text Le Pays, in which the narrator explores her shifting relationship to her own pregnant body. In the 2017 novel Notre Vie dans les Forêts, in English, Our Lives in the Forest, Darrieussecq introduces the reader to a futuristic world where all bodily disease has been cured by advances in cloning technology. Told from the perspective of a psychotherapist named Viviane, whose body is gradually falling into pieces, this narrative raises the question about contemporary desire for physical perfection and its effect on subjective and social experience. So, to engage with this symposium's objective of exploring the fears, anxieties, and desires that society projects onto the body, what I'd like to focus on today is Darrieussecq's portrayal of a world without disease as a means to examine how her novel challenges contemporary understandings of human and transhuman subjectivity and the ethical dilemmas posed by scientific advancement in an age of material capitalism. Before beginning my reading of the novel, I'd like to briefly outline main themes of current debates surrounding human enhancement and their relation to the body, illness, and subjectivity. The desire for physical enhancement has long been a concern of science fiction and utopian literature. Two examples include Charles Fourier's colourful idea for the arche libre, dexterous third arm that he conjures in his 1816 treatise Le Nouveau Monde Amoureux, and Frederick Pohl's depiction of a cyborg program in his 1976 novel Man Plus. Although such ideas may seem out of this world, the increasing rate of technological advancement seen over recent years mean that the possibility of humankind undergoing some kind of physical transformation is becoming increasingly likely. Over the past decades, advances in biomedical sciences have seen the implementation of new technology in order to cure disease or overcome physical dysfunctions. So a few examples include pacemakers used to treat heart disease, or the use of robotic arms that give quadriplegic patients the possibility to regain motor functions. However, scientific progress has also opened up the possibility for non-therapeutic enhancements of the human body, such as cosmetic surgery. As ethicists Nick Bostrom and Julian Savulescu have outlined, the idea of transforming humanity beyond its natural bounds is an area of active debate for philosophers and scientists alike. On one side of this debate is the techno-utopian movement of transhumanism, which involves a desire to intensify and extend uniquely human properties beyond their normal physical parameters. Whereas transhumanists argue for the free implementation of enhancement technologies, bioconservatives, on the other hand, believe that alterations of human biology will produce negative effects on the human condition and so should be rigorously controlled. The main ethical questions posed in such debates relate to who can gain access to physical enhancements, whether they should be therapeutically implemented, and how they might be regulated. These questions are played out in Darrieussecq's novel, as in her futuristic world, along with the appearance of drones and robots. Thanks to advances in cloning technology, most humans of this new world are equipped with a moitié, or half, that lies dormant, serving as an organ bank to cure the pathological conditions of their human counterparts. This paradigm questions both the physical limits of the human body and the possibility of overcoming them, as the narrative gradually unfolds to reveal a subjective destabilization of Darrieussecq's humanity, or as we later learn, transhumanity. Beginning with an analysis of human doubling through the figure of the clone, I will then consider the portrayal of bodily decay and dissection as a further decentering of Darrieussecq's human subjects, before concluding with an exploration of the textual discontinuity of this work as a reflexive mirroring of the character's own corporeal fragmentation and how this influences our interpretation of the narrative. The notion of doubling appears across multiple aspects of the novel. The narrator and protagonist, Viviane, is a psychotherapist, a profession extremely close to Darrieussecq's own profession before becoming a writer. Similarly, Viviane's clone is named Marie, introducing yet another avatar of the author into the narrative. Moreover, Viviane's narration, which retrospectively recounts the events that occurred before she came to join the fugitives hiding with their clones in the forest, frames the character's attempt to order the narrative in parallel to that of the reader, who themselves appears as the vous or you addressed throughout the novel. The figure of the clone, however, provides an important starting point for our reading of bodily enhancement. The narrator's clone Marie, or La Chuchote, in English the wuss, as she is also referred to, spends most of her life in the Centre de Repos, or rest centre, where she remains in a sort of medically induced coma, waiting for her organs to be removed according to the various afflictions of her human double. The clone's artificially dormant state calls to mind Michel Foucault's notion of the docile body, which provides a physical manifestation of ideological power over the individual. As Foucault explains, the docile body takes its form from the optimization of its capabilities and its integration into systems of efficient and economic controls. By serving as an organ bank, the clone thus emphasizes the body's condition as a material object, to be used as society and science see fit. We can thus already see how this figure acts to destabilize traditional notions of subjectivity. Perhaps the most important aspect when considering the figure of the clone is its status as a replicant of the human, the original human. As Jean Baudrillard reminds us in The Vital Illusion, cloning involves a regression towards a minimal state of differentiation among living beings. This process of doubling carries with it a troubling potential, as through the removal of difference, the act of cloning foregrounds the liminal nature of our own status as individuals. In Darrieussecq's novel, this sense of subjective decentering can be read through the apparent need to maintain boundaries between the humans and their clones. Initially referred to as les corps, bodies, instead of les moitiés, the halves, as they are later known, Viviane's narration reveals both a linguistic and institutional separation between the humans and their doubles. This sense of distance is also demonstrated through the protagonist's description of Marie, which remains fixated on their perceived aesthetic difference, as she remarks, La psychologue disait que nous avons le même nez au millimètre, les mêmes yeux, les mêmes sourcils, les mêmes mâchoires, tout exactement pareil. Et donc, que je suis aussi jolie que Marie. Mais ce n'est pas vrai. The accumulation of anatomical traits through this passage once again highlights the estranging sense of physical materiality evoked through Darrieussecq's narration. However, this practice also acts to underline the very discrepancy that can form through the ubiquity of such labels, as the combined similarity and difference of the two characters elicits a form of objection for Viviane through this very rupture in signification. This uncanny connection becomes a source of disturbing fascination for the protagonist, whereby the sight of Marie's unblemished face makes Viviane want to bludgeon it. She also whispers into Marie's ear while she's sleeping to see the clone's eyes open in an expression of terror. The sense of objection is also evoked by the infantilizing depiction of the clone once she's been freed from the rest center. Although Viviane describes the clone as comme un bébé, like a baby, although both she and the clone have now reached the age of 40, and recounts with an unsettling mixture of humour and frustration how she was obliged to teach Marie how to walk. As she states, vous prenez un grand corps mou de près de 40 ans, même si elle en fait 25 à peine, un beau brin de fille, et vous la mettez debout, vous la verticalisez, elle ouvre les yeux et puis, elle tombe. These descriptions outline the differences between the human and the clone according to what the narrator considers to be the natural and unnatural aspects of our human existence. For instance, signs of aging and our ability to walk. And in doing so, highlight how our physical capacities remain central to our means of defining the human condition, which the figure of the clone acts to destabilize. Viviane's moitié exists as both a double and a literal half of the human she lives for and is unable to live without. This reflexive process of doubling this highlights precisely what is missing for the protagonist, who in turn needs the clone to keep her body whole. As we shall now see through our consideration of dissection, Darrieussecq's portrayal of a world without disease threatens to destabilize how we conceive of the human condition and its innate pathologies. From the very beginning of the novel, we learn that the protagonist has a physical defect. One of her eyes has been removed as she was diagnosed with a degenerative form of prosopagnosia, also known as face blindness. This is only one of a string of disorders Viviane's body is assuaged by. As the narrative progresses, we gradually learn that she was born with only one lung and has kidney failure, leading to the transplantation of 2 organs from Marie's body. Although the various symptoms of her pathological condition can be cured through the recurring process of dissection and transplantation, it would appear that the inborn cause for her illnesses cannot be overcome, as she becomes increasingly fixated on the imperfect conditions of her body. The character describes herself at one point as bricolée et charcutée, cobbled together and butchered, evoking the image of a Frankenstein-like patchwork of body parts. Unlike her kidney and lung, her eye isn't replaced, leaving Viviane plagued by a sense of loss as she imagines the presence of a phantom eye under her skull. In addition to the troubling implication of subscribing to the account of the narrator whose own vision is obstructed, Viviane's physical defects underline the feeling of incompleteness that come to dominate her existence, as we have seen with the earlier comparison between her beauty and that of the unblemished Marie. The sense of physical insecurity is also embodied by another character, Romero. Romero would appear to be one of the healthier humans of this new world. He competes in pentathlons, and Viviane even describes him as un athlète complet, a complete athlete. However, despite these superficial signs of perfection, he too has bodily defects, as Viviane discovers when spending the night with him. As she states, je ne dormais pas et tout le souvenir de cette nuit se réduit à la vision du dentier de Romero dans un verre, une rangée de dents montées sur un support rose imitant la gencive, dans un liquide effervescent. The protagonist's fixation on the synthetic nature of Romero's false teeth highlights not only the unnatural nature of the character's attempt at overcoming his physical flaw, but also Viviane's own obsession with physical perfection, as she later demands that he ask for a transplant. Unsurprisingly, they soon separate after this incident, due to what Viviane herself describes as her trouble de l'attachement, or attachment disorder. This pervading sense of both bodily and social fragmentation appears to be a product of the institutionalized world of Darrieussecq's novel. Another character that Viviane becomes involved with is the enigmatic cliqueur, whose job consists of decoding human practices and emotions into a series of single words so that robots can learn to perform in the same way. Viviane, in turn, as a psychotherapist, tries to help people live with their feelings of internal disorder. Or in her words, mon métier, la façon dont on m'a formé, c'était de rendre possible pour les gens les traumatismes qu'ils ont vécus. This description further problematizes the nature of care in the novel, where humankind is treated not to be cured, but in order to keep functioning. Viviane, however, soon becomes overwhelmed by her own psychological trauma, as her feelings of guilt lead to gruesome nightmares in which she is consuming the body of her clone, as we can see in this citation where she begins by eating a finger and then develops a taste for the clone and continues up the onion. These troubling thoughts and the encouragement of the cliqueur lead to Viviane's decision de se déconnecter, to disconnect from the institutionalized world around her, as she disappears into the forest with her clone. This shift in the novel's framework would thus appear to mark the end to the endless cycle of dissection and transplantation in the novel, thereby reaching towards a sense of resolution where the moitié and her human double are united, maybe even becoming whole. However, in drawing to its conclusion, the narrative enacts this time a formal break that threatens to undermine our initial interpretation of the novel. This occurs while in forest, the cliqueur discovers a series of videos which he shares with Viviane, showing idyllic images of elderly people walking along a white beach. Our protagonist first assumes that these videos are some sort of advertising. However, they zoom in on one particular woman to reveal a striking resemblance between her face and Viviane's. This mise en abîme splinters the narrative frame, as the description of the elderly woman's face as bricolée et modifiée, patchworked and modified, comes to parallel the disjointed structure of the novel. As readers, we learn that Viviane is in fact not a human with a clone double, but is herself a clone, a third, or perhaps one of a potentially vast series of copies in a line of mass bodily production. Reduced to the same status as Marie, Viviane's illnesses are no longer born out of her own biological dysfunctions, but rather are revealed to be the direct product of an all too human obsession with immortality and materiality. According to the cliqueur, the individuals wealthy enough to afford clones are part of the 1% of the extreme rich who possess 99% of the world's riches. Viviane and Marie's predecessor is estimated to be 160 years old. This woman is thus no longer human, but through her series of transplants has become transhuman, extending her body's capacities piece by piece to live beyond the limits of mortality. The character is evoked as a somewhat monstrous figure. As Viviane remarks, en cercle autour de son œil gauche, il y avait une fine cicatrice. C'était mon œil, l'œil qui me manquait. J'avais un sentiment dans le ventre, noire comme de l'abîme et glaciale. Je me suis dit, j'ai peur. C'est ça, elle me fait peur. Elle est effrayante, abominablement. The scar around the woman's eye can be seen to symbolize something of a fault line and the supposedly utopian ideal of immortality. As through this grotesque description, the narrator reveals how desire for eternal life can come at the cost of morality, thereby highlighting the fragility of the line between enhancement and denigration. Through the narrator's estranging perspective, it is thus the post-human clone whose body is in pieces, who is most closely aligned with the reader, thereby reframing illness as a sign of our very humanity. The discontinuity of the novel's structure, in which the narrator recounts her life through a disjointed series of fragments, thus acts to further underscore the reflexive nature of the narrative. Much like the description of the narrator's own mind, in reading this text, we wander through a forest of signs and words, exploring possible pathways that have the potential to transform our trajectory. In this way, Diasek's novel encourages us as readers to contemplate the innate pathologies of our own condition as human subjects and the ethical implication of any changes to our biology.
Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Dr. Marta Arnaldi, who is a stipendiary lecturer at St. Anne's College, University of Oxford. She has recently been elected to a Laming Junior Fellowship at the Queen's College, Oxford, with a project analyzing the interplay of medicine and translation in contemporary English, French, and Italian poetry. She published 7 articles in 2 book chapters, which combine perspectives from different research areas, from anthology studies to translation studies, and from philology to ethics. Marta is also a former student of medicine, a writer, and a dancer. Her first collection of poems, Ikaka, from 2016, won 2 international literary prizes. Today she'll be presenting on From Illness to Healing, Therapeutic Translation in Contemporary Italian Women's Poetry.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizer, Kit, for her kind invitation. I feel very privileged to be here today, as this symposium represents an important platform for me, where I will be able to share for the first time the data of a completely new project. Because this piece of research is at an embryonic stage, I would like to try and trace some of the lines of inquiry that lie at its core, in the hope to sketch and explore, rather than define and contain, the boundaries of a research territory that is yet to be discovered, i.e. that of the translation of medical humanities. As a result, today's paper will be more analytical and less theoretical. After introducing the metaphor of translation as therapy, it will focus on a series of examples drawn from the repertoire of contemporary Italian women's poetry. The doubly eccentric, or if one prefers, doubly marginal lens, women's poetry on the one hand and medical poetry on the other, is used not only to problematize and enrich the notion of a female-authored canon, but also to illuminate an unorthodox biocultural path that deviates from the usual courses of contemporary poetry and of conventional medicine. To start with, I would like to share some of the texts and images that inspired this project. I've chosen them because they hint at a metaphor of therapeutic translation in an evocative yet persuasive manner. For instance, this is the touching ending of Nicola Gardini's latest novel, La vita non vissuta, The Unlived Life, in which the author compares the ill person to a translation. You can see the ill person is comparable to a translation because he lives in a continuous state of change, where the departure and the destination are not easily recognizable, where the distinction between gain and loss is also difficult to trace, and so on and so forth. The second example is drawn from a classic of feminist writing on being ill, where Virginia Woolf famously declares the untranslatability of illness. And finally, these are the words of a contemporary Polish novelist, Olga Tokarczuk, I think, sorry. pronunciation, who in her latest novel, Flight, draws an interesting parallel between internal and external worlds, geography and anatomy. Thanks to these authors and images, we understand that illness, and in fact medicine itself, can be described as a foreign land and even as a foreign tongue, one that lends itself to translation for ethical reasons as well as for aesthetic purposes. Forms of therapeutic translation, however, are to be found also outside the realm of literature. Interdisciplinary research conducted in the past few years has shown evidence of this. Table 1 provides details of different clinical cases, mainly of psychiatrist nature, in which translation has been employed as a form of art therapy. For reasons of time, I won't be able to discuss them. However, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that these studies are all based on the idea that the cultural and the clinical are indeed inseparable dimensions in any medical practice. In line with this principle, I shall now introduce 3 forms or models of therapeutic translation as they have been used by 4 Italian women poets from the 1950s up to the present. Table 2 offers a snapshot of the poets that we will be reading today and of the models of therapeutic translation that we will be discussing: outer translation, inner translation, and self-translation. I define outer translation the process whereby the poet-patient uses translation as a means to express in words her own illness or that of other people. In geometric terms, we could say that the direction of the vector of communication goes here from the inside outwards, i.e. from the patient to the doctor, or if one prefers, from the writer to the reader. Conversely, inner translation occurs when the poet-patient translates the doctor's medical jargon into a comprehensible language. In this case, the direction of the vector goes from the inside inwards, from the outside inwards, i.e. from the doctor to the patient. Finally, self-translation is a hybrid category including poets-patients who 1. write in more than one language, 2. write in a language that is not their own, or 3. adapted their poetic verse to a different medium: theatre, sculpture, installations, textiles. It goes without saying that these are fluid, non-sclerotic categories. For instance, writers such as Amelia Rosselli fit more than one category. Similarly, self-translation as a therapeutic tool includes various subcategories and authors. I should mention here that the list of Italian female poets falling into these categories is a long and controversial one. Therefore, today I'm presenting a limited, non-comprehensive selection which I hope to enlarge and complete in the article that I'm currently preparing. It is also worth noticing that most of the writers soon to be analyzed are prolific translators themselves, in the strict sense, especially from the English and the French. I would like to start my analysis with Vivian Lamarck, poet and translator of La Fontaine, Valéry, Prévert, and Baudelaire. Lamarck was born near Trento, not far from Austria, at the end of the Second World War, and spent most of her life as a schoolteacher in Milan. Her ostensibly childlike poetry, beginning with Teresino in the 1980s, is directly concerned with her personal life, and in the trilogy Il Signore d'Oro, Il Signore degli Spaventati, and Poesie dando da lei, she deals with her experience of psychoanalysis. The trilogy is dedicated to her Jungian analyst Dr. B.M. and represents one of the peaks of 20th century Italian poetry. The first poem that I present today, A Nove Mesi, at the age of 9 months, reproduces the movement of auto-translation in as much as it captures the poet as she is, and I'm quoting, metaphorizing and translating the trauma of being an abandoned child. I'm quoting here from a study by Elise Pestre, published in 1929. Let us remember that Lamarck was abandoned by her mother when she was 9 months old, hence the title of the poem. It is interesting to notice how the translation metaphor provides here the lexicon and images of this poetry, also on a stylistic level. As we can read on lines 3 and 4, the poet's child is looking for the original amongst an overwhelming number of copies, and here the original is her natural mother, or we may say a more abstract mother tongue. Ogni volta, ogni affetto le sembrano coppie e cerca l'originale. Every face, every loved one end up being just mere copies. She's looking for the original. So once gradually and laboriously put into words, traumatic events need to be translated by the doctor into a meaningful healing language. In this sense, both the patient and the clinical psychologist act as translators, thus facilitating the utterance of trauma, or if you will, the passage of trauma from the inside outwards. In the second and third poems, Lamarck addresses the doctor directly, evoking the words and processes that contributed to her recovery. Among these processes, we can appreciate the doctor's identification with Adam, the first man, a posture that allows him to bring positive feelings into being, even just by naming them. So la gaiezza is joy, an entity, a feeling that did not exist before and that the doctor brings to life just by way of mentioning it. Similarly, in the second poem, we are confronted with the doctor's healing wisdom, which reminds us of that of Christ the Medic in the New Testament. Lei con la sua sapienza mi ha curata. With your wisdom you have healed me. I am your Vivian, almost born again. To sum up this section, for Lamarck, the act of writing begins with illness. My newborn poetry is already ill, she says, and ends with the interpretative, translatorly act of the doctor and of the reader, who both decipher and transform the language of her unconscious. The case of Margherita Guidacci is similar to that of Lamarck insofar as she also dedicates poems to her doctors, to the Dr. R, to the Dr. Z, and so on and so forth. Quite distinctively, however, Guidacci's doctors are not Christ-like figures, but rather monstrous, chaotic beasts that she describes from the perspective of a prisoner and of an exile. In this manner, Guidacci's style brings to the fore a new form of dimension of therapeutic translation. In The Waiting Room, the opening poem of Nero Suite, published in 1970, Guidacci states that in a mental hospital, patients are given a Greek name, that is a foreign name, as a remedy for the illness. Tutto il conforto che di là era in serbo, un nome greco per il loro male. All the comfort that we could give, a Greek name for our evil or illness. Since the patients are unable to translate the doctor's obscure vocabulary into beneficial treatment, the distance between the language of the patients and the jargon of the doctors becomes incommensurable. Evidently, Nero Suite, which has long been read as an example of Dantean intertextuality, is in fact an original exercise in medical communication, one that could potentially be brought to the attention of health professionals and medical students. In this final session, I shall focus on two distinctive yet interconnected cases of therapeutic self-translation: Diary in Three Tongues by trilingual poet Amelia Rosselli, and the musical and theatrical adaptations of Alda Merini's poetry, realized thanks to her collaboration with musician Giovanni Nuti and singer Simone Cristicchi. Let's start with Rosselli. Born in exile in Paris, the daughter of Marion Cave, English labor activist, and of Carlo Rosselli, a prominent Italian anti-fascist, killed by Mussolini's emissaries in France. According to critic Pino Tinucci, quotation 1, Diary in Three Tongues is the text that best conveys Rosselli's innovative understanding and use of multilingualism, interlanguage and intra-language translation, as well as the psychotic disintegration of language when it reaches the proximity of its traumatic source, and in the case of Rosselli, the trauma being her father's assassination. In her article entitled Poetics in the Shadow of the Other's Language, quotation 2, Antinucci goes even further as she assumes that this text could well be a continuation of the psychic work that Rosselli felt compelled to carry on, having profoundly understood that it was out of the reach of her analysis. The practice of translation, which is at the center of Rosselli's purpose, manifests itself as a conflation of languages, repeating the experience of shock and trauma. As you can see from these examples, Rosselli almost managed to put into words Wool's untranslatability of illness, and by doing so, she created a sort of new vocabulary to speak the unspeakable. And these series of thoughts almost look like entries of a multilingual encyclopedia of sorrow. Sorry. Before moving to the conclusions, I would like to briefly touch on Aldo Merini's engagement with music and theatre as a further example of self-translation, in this case, or self-adaptation, in this case from poetry to a different medium. As Sarkacci's patient herself, Merini embraced the possibilities of art therapy in its complexities and metamorphoses. In the video that I shall play for you, hopefully will work, we will have the opportunity to watch Merini reading and performing one of her own poems, an act of intermediatic self-translation. The poem will then undergo a second translation process as it is set to music by her collaborator Nutin Kristiki. The video is the registration of a performance held at the Strehel Theatre, Milan in 2010. So, while this girl, I prepared a very rough translation. The poem is entitled Poets, and it reads, "We are bones with no questions. We are poets, we are peasants who carry the earth to their Venus. We are usurers, full of crosses. We are convents do not produce blood. We are a faith with no prophets, but we are poets, as lonely as beasts. We neither a free house nor a stone to be able to feel." Well, I hope this works. Ok.
Noi, costretti dentro le ombre del vino, non abbiamo parole né potere per invogliare gli altri avventori. Siamo ossi, senza domande, riceviamo tutti, solo chi abbiamo un cuore. Siamo poeti, poveri, fatti di versi pesanti ed intimi di calori di bosco. Siamo contadini che portano la terra venere, siamo odorrai pieni di croci, siamo conventi che non danno sangue, siamo una fede senza profeti, ma siamo poeti, soli come le bestie, buttati per tutti i fanghi, senza una casa libera né uno stato per sentimento.
E tutti noi costretti dentro le ombre del vento, non abbiamo parole né potere per invogliare gli altri avventori.
Siamo osti senza domande, riceviamo tutti solo che abbiamo un cuore. Abbiamo un cuore.
Siamo poeti poveri.
Okay, this was just to give you an idea. Let me see. Okay. Perfect. So, to come to a conclusion, I would like to try and place the results of this analysis into broader critical discourse. First of all, this study has shown that translation is a kaleidoscopic concept, far from being fully comprehended. Its almost unlimited potential helps us see the world of medicine and healthcare from a different perspective, one that uses not only includes poetry and literature. Second, that the medical is a dimension of the cultural that has often been forgotten, not only by clinicians, but also by literary historians and critics. And third, that the cross-fertilization of women's poetry and medical poetry has the potential to open up new horizons for the study of women's writing, the literary canons, and the medical humanities. Rather than creating a further ghetto for marginalized authors, themes, and theories, it has revealed, I hope, a fruitful point of convergence between medicine, feminism, and the arts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker, our last panelist is Robert Craig. Robert Craig is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Bamberg in Germany, where he teaches courses on British, German, and comparative literature and culture. And he's currently researching configurations of embodiment in German and British modernism. He holds a PhD in German from Cambridge and has published articles on the philosophy of social networking technologies, Alfred Doblin's novels, and Günter Grass. He co-edited the volume Biological Discourses, The Language of Science and Literature around 1900, which came out with Peter Lang in 2017, and his monograph on Alfred Doblin entitled Monsters, Cyborgs, and Berliners is forthcoming in Legenda's Germanic Literature series. He will be speaking today on learning from pathology, Alfred Doblin between medicine and literature.
Thank you very much. He will unsettle you, he will haunt your dreams. You'll have to swallow, you won't like his taste, he's indigestible, unwholesome even. He'll change his reader. If you're satisfied with yourself, beware of Alfred Doblin. So as far as literary health warnings go, it doesn't come much more categorical than that. Doblin is a risky prospect, Günter Grass told his audience in a tribute to his late teacher, 10 years after the latter's death, in 1967. All in all, not really a book club recommendation. Doblin's masterpiece, Berlin Alexanderplatz of 1929, was an immediate literary sensation, but the depth of his influence on German literature, not least through Bertolt Brecht and Grass himself, both was and remains relatively under-acknowledged. As Grass pointed out, Doblin made experimental and path-breaking contributions to an array of genres, from the historical novel through science fiction to the epic city narrative, and in fact very few modernist writers engage so intensively with figurations that we might today call sort of post-human and post-humanist. But his warning here of readerly indigestion also reflects on a novelist who is preoccupied with the dynamics of embodied experience, both normal and pathological, sightly and unsightly. Doblin observed the contradictions and paradoxes of embodiment as both an author and a doctor with training in psychiatry, at the same time as he was writing his early stories in 1904 to 1905. This native Berliner was also completing a doctorate at the University of Freiburg on long-term memory loss as a result of Korsakoff syndrome, induced in this case by chronic alcoholism. And his career-long negotiations with the relationship between the mind and the body highlight his importance for our theme today. Doblin was, of course, just one of a number of illustrious doctor writers in German and Austrian modernism, two of the most famous names being Arthur Schnitzler and Gottfried Benn. However, he sustained a particularly complex and self-reflective relationship between his two vocations. Not only is his literary work crisscrossed with pathologies that he encountered in his clinical practice, but it's also partly shaped stylistically by aspects of the early psychiatric case study. And modern sort of scientific psychiatry had really only come into its own as a discrete discipline in the 1870s, in Germany in particular. And under the German psychiatrist Emil Kreppelin's defining influence, psychiatry had turned away from neurology's sort of classificatory mapping of the brain and towards the act of describing patients' behaviours and documenting their self-narratives, however irrational or illogical they might be. In fact, in a famous aesthetic manifesto from 1913, the so-called Berliner Programm, of which I've sort of reproduced an extract here, Doblin called on authors to turn away from what he saw as the psychological realism of 19th century prose, and what he saw as its preoccupations with the why and the how of human motivation. Instead, as he says here, authors should learn from psychiatry, reproducing psychical and sensory data in its raw and sometimes chaotic immediacy. And he evokes in particular the Wortkünstler, the word artists of Dada with their sort of fascination with the kind of texture, with the tactility of language itself. And Dada was to have a very significant impact on Dublin's novels in particular. Dublin was working out some of these principles before he wrote this, what became a very famous manifesto, in his early stories. And this kind of proverbially psychiatric aesthetics also intersected there with the marks of what Michael Cowan has identified as the Willenskultur, or the culture of the will, of early 20th century Germany, Wilhelmine Germany, and Europe more generally. And in brief, and we've heard a little bit about aspects of that discourse today, but this was a kind of multifaceted cultural, therapeutic, and pedagogical endeavour to sort of bolster the resources of the will and willpower, and to affirm its centralising agency over a passive, nervous, or indeed sort of abulic body. And Michael Cowan associates this elevation of mind over matter, even though it's obviously a bit more complex than that, but he associates it particularly with the aesthetics of German Expressionism. And in this paper, I want to trace the creative intersections of those separate but related discourses, this culture of the will and this emergent discourse of psychiatry, in Dublin's short prose. And I'll focus on two classics of expressionist short prose and Dublin's two most widely read stories, Die Ermordung einer Butterblume, The Murder of a Buttercup, and Die Tänzerin und der Leib, The Dancer and the Body, written between 1904 and 1905 and published in book form in 1912. And I particularly want to ask how quite a sort of complex relationship and dialectics of mind and matter are refracted through the portrayals of two very different pathological bodies in these stories. And I'll conclude by sort of tentatively suggesting some senses in which Dublin's work might question some of the more sort of dualistic assumptions and foundations of medical humanism, a sort of broadly defined paradigm which still underpins quite a lot of work in the context of the medical humanities. So, in The Murder of a Buttercup, the petty bourgeois Freiburg businessman Michael Fischer accidentally decapitates a buttercup with his walking stick when it becomes caught in some undergrowth on the edge of the Black Forest. And these are some stills from a recent theatrical adaptation from earlier this year. After watching a doppelganger of himself murder the flower, his imagination runs away with itself. What begins as a daft private joke, being found out and prosecuted for the murder, rapidly becomes a paranoid bid to track down the mutilated buttercup, whom he's posthumously christened Ellen, and cover up her remains. Torn between his fury at the dead flower, a frantic fear of the consequences, and a perverse sort of, well, almost polymorphously perverse excitement, he imagines himself hunted down by a mythically vengeful forest. So a mythic logic of substitution and atonement begins to set in. Fisher sets up a private business account for Ellen and offers her food and drink in absentia at each mealtime. He's finally descended to a point of suicidal despair, unable to expiate this egregious crime, when he has the idea of contractually tricking Ellen by planting a younger rival for his affection, a daughter no less, with the legal code's paragraph on debt compensation written on the plant pot. And this sort of dastardly ruse continues until one evening his cleaning lady admits that she's knocked the plant pot over and swept the contents into the bin. And Fisher's ecstatic. He's contractually free of his debt to the buttercup in his own mind, and so able to massacre as many flowers as he wants, which he duly does, before vanishing into the darkness of the forest, and it's implied irretrievably into madness. So a sort of parable of man's transgressive relationship with nature is sort of, which is one of Dublin's enduring themes, is filtered through the blind alleys of a sort of indeterminate form of paranoia. Fisher's own self-justification after decapitating various flowers, that you get nervous in the city makes me nervous, man wird nervös in der Stadt, die Stadt macht mich nervös, speaks to a contemporary discourse of sort of nervousness and the nervous body more generally. This sort of clean-shaven, sort of buttoned-up Freiburg businessman, clean-shavenness being a kind of mark of effeminacy and effeminateness and sort of Wilhelmine culture, is shown trying to sort of exercise a kind of overcompensating, neurotic kind of self-discipline. Our first glimpse is of a man obsessively counting his steps, and we're told in passing that he slaps his apprentices if they don't swat the office flies quickly enough and present them to their boss in strict order of size. And we've got an expression of this kind of the underpinning violence of this internal self-control in this quotation here. In one of the story's many kind of crossovers of mind and body, Fisher's violent attempts to assert control over his wayward and willful thoughts, or his eigenwillige Gedanken, are mirrored in his desire to tame the little horses, the Pferdchen, that are his uncontrollable little feet, which keep pushing willfully onwards despite his shouting at them. And revealingly, actually, that word eigenwillig, sort of meaning willful, wayward, maverick, applies to both his mental processes and his limbs. In short, the mind's sovereignty depends on its willful but precarious ability to centralise the body's sort of chaotic, incommensurable energies, if you like, the body's own will, if you like. And this passage sort of appropriately ends as Fisher plunges his knife into a tree, turning that sort of internalised violence outwards onto a metonymy of nature itself. So this quotation just gives one snapshot of a style which, in its kind of imitation of the sort of terse, matter-of-fact approach of Dublin's doctoral psychiatric case study, mimics early German psychiatry's tersely observational sort of style of describing and recounting irrational behaviours. His short clauses and paratactic sentences are sprinkled with hallucinations and sort of shards of free and direct discourse, and what results is a sort of jerky, stop-motion kind of rhythm. And the story's almost mechanistic narrative effect is echoed in one observation that Fisher himself moves mechanically, another ailment of modern urban life that willpower was supposed to overcome. But his internal narrative of crime, revenge, and expiation also bears resemblance to a phenomenon called confabulation, so a fabrication of imaginary experiences in compensation for the loss of long-term memory, and with that personal identity itself. And confabulation is a phenomenon that Dublin actually discusses at great length in his dissertation study of Korsakoff syndrome. And interestingly enough, it's also a phenomenon that Oliver Sacks discusses at length in The Man Who Mistook a Wife for a Hat, in relation in a kind of negative foil to normal processes of identity construction. And this is where the sort of discourse of the will and the observational modus operandi of psychiatry intersect with the logic of myth. In fact, as Christina Emig has shown, on the basis of Dublin's interest in Greek tragedy, the story echoes with particular motifs from Aeschylus's play The Humanities. Fisher's running through the forest in a paranoid terror that the trees are literally gathering to pass judgment on him, closely resembles Orestes' attempts to outrun the Furies in the Humanities, who are thirsting after revenge for his murder of Clytemnestra. But the decapitation of the buttercup is also reconstructed in Fisher's increasingly wild imagination as a crime against a figuratively female nature. In fact, as he watches his doppelganger perform this awful murder, the beheading is kind of refigured as a grotesque ejaculation. And actually one of Dublin's signature defamiliarising techniques lies in this kind of almost vertiginous shifting, as it were, between the unsettlingly comic and the really downright shocking. And this mediation between Fisher's hallucination and the logic of myth offers an image of extreme sexualised male violence. And the properly abject, in sort of Kristeva's sense, glimpse of the rotting plant head, here at the bottom here, with its yellow effluvium, and which Fisher spends much of the story trying to find and cover up, is a kind of female other which simultaneously disgusts, terrifies, and also excites him. And that very Dublin-esque neologism of Pflanzenkopf right at the beginning, the severed plant head sank awkwardly down and buried into the grass, really mirrors a sort of irresolvable entanglement of mind, flesh, and this sort of external, figuratively female nature. And what's so compelling about the story, for all its sort of unsightly and quite disgusting edges actually, is how seemingly incommensurable medical discourses and mythic motifs enter the same narrative space without in any sense cancelling each other out. So they leave behind a kind of unsettling hermeneutic remainder, a hermeneutic remnant, if you like. At the end of the story, mind finally succumbs to matter, just as matter succumbs to mind. Fisher declares open season on all buttercups and vanishes in every conceivable sense into the darkness of the forest. So by tricking nature, he's tricked by it, in quite a sort of Homeric term, and rather like the bank of weeds in which his walking stick becomes caught, the story's sort of tangle of discourses and motifs both tempts us into an interpretation and at the same time resists any attempt at one. And in fact, throughout this early collection of stories, we experience quite a similar sense of undecidability, indeterminacy to the one that we feel, for example, with Kafka's Metamorphosis, which was published in exactly the same year. So Fisher's loosening hold on both body and mind as he searches for the buttercup corpse is mirrored, in a sense, in our own search for an elusive key to this pathological text. And if the body has the last word through the mind here, then the mind triumphs just as ambivalently in The Dancer and the Body. Ella, the protagonist we learn, was destined for dancing from the age of 11 because it suited an oddball temperament that was oriented towards control, self-discipline and self-contortion. Her choreographic discipline reflects sort of many early 20th century ideologies, again relating to this culture of the will, of dance education as an aesthetic exercise in strengthening the force of the will by means of the body. And actually, as Michael Cowan has argued, the Jacques Delcour's method of music, dance and rhythmical gymnastics, which was pioneered by the Swiss composer and music educator Émile Jacques Delcourt in 1911 at his educational institute in Dresden, actually saw one of the central goals of this dance education as bringing about the controlled direction of the body through the bodily performance of music and dance. It wasn't just a sort of school for training musicians and dancers, even though it was primarily that as well. And this is a photo from a sort of institute performance of the Afternoon of Reform from 1922. So the austerity of form and style, again, in Dublin's story, which again is very redolent, really, of Dublin's doctoral case study, mimics the sublimated violence of Ella's dancing. As she comes to master her art, we learn that she crept carefully and patiently down into her toes, her ankles, her knees. She greedily attacked her slender shoulders, and the curve of her thin arms kept furtive watch over the play of this taut body. She managed to throw cold water over even the most voluptuous dance. So there's a literal kind of creepiness, an uncanny separation yet intertwining of self and body in this image. And the expression überviel habgierig, so greedily attacked, betrays the body's tacit complicity in this assault on itself. At the age of 19, she succumbs to an indeterminate consumptive illness and is taken to hospital in an ironic play of the fin de siècle motif of the femme fragile. The slight androgynous form, pale face, and oversized dark eyes make for a melancholy parody of the aesthetic of consumption. But this is a very different aesthetic space to that of sort of idealized transfiguration and death. Ella's loss of the ability to speak in hospital, her aphasia, is a particularly succinct expression of the inseparability of meaning and corporeality. But still, even after losing this ability, she persists in disciplining a body that starts to take on, again, a doppelganger life of its own. While she wants to silence it and even make it sort of abject as a kind of piece of carrion, ein Stück Aas, she must at the same time retreat into it in order quite literally to defend her own integrity from controlling doctors who want to dissect and despoil her body by sort of diagnosing and categorizing her, chopping away at her piece by piece. The story's denouement draws upon an image of Ella exerting meticulous aesthetic control. She desires silk and linen. The verb begehrt is emotionally, but also in part libidinally loaded. And she stitches the image of herself thumbing her nose at the doctors before plunging a pair of scissors into the fat, two-legged sphere that is her body in this representation. and her embroidered pre-performance of suicide is actually itself a sort of subversive imitation of the embroidery-based therapies for nervous disorders that were a staple in psychiatric clinics in the early 20th century. A final waltz between dancer and body, the final dance, is shot through with Ella's contemptuous fantasy of violence against it, combined with the gendered recognition of its mastery over her. And note that there's there is here a kind of interesting sort of inversion of the sort of typical gendered relationship between self and body, where the body here is figured as ihr Herr, her master, in sort of masculine terms. And in a mirror image of her stitched picture, she finally, for real, plunges her sewing needle into her left breast, bringing the body under terminal control by terminally silencing it. Her dying cry is uncannily disembodied. It stands in the corner of the room, again a very Dublin-esque sort of concretisation of the abstract. But the body plays its final trick in the ironic epitaph that in death the dancer still had that cold, contemptuous look on her lips. Ella's attempted mastery over the body is inescapably embodied. So by pushing ideologies of willful discipline to their pathological extremes, both stories critique and question those discourses and therapies that would subjugate and normalise the body precisely by enlisting the body's energies and resources. And there's certainly a prefiguration of the sort of economy of the ego, id, and the superego in Freud's topographical model of the psyche, and which he developed in the 1920s, and Dublin himself practiced psychotherapy. He was a psychotherapist in Berlin in the 20s. And the affinities, remind us of the real discursive cross-currents between early psychoanalysis and its literary contexts. But we're also reminded of Adorno and Horkheimer's later argument here in Dialectic of Enlightenment, that the human subject's desired autonomy from nature paradoxically entails an internalised violence against the body. And that's a dialectic that Dublin really returns to throughout his career. But by critiquing attempts to secure a sovereignty of mind over matter, Dublin perhaps also unsettles some of the, this is my tentative conclusion here, some of the dualistic assumptions underlie perhaps the paradigm of medical humanism. The culture of the will was certainly one forerunner of current technologies of the self, to quote Foucault, most notably in what Cowan calls the contemporary motivational paradigm in therapy, focused on maximising the subject's mental energy through the performative practices of the body. But in a related vein, and as the ethical philosopher Geoffrey Bishop has argued, even such admirably empathetic frameworks as that of narrative medicine, for example, may unwittingly help to reinforce certain dualisms of mind and matter, narrative and body, and meaning and materiality. So a comprehensible subjective narrative is attached to the body as a treatable biochemical object, thus potentially eliding the reality of their qualitative interdependence. And it's telling, actually, that both protagonists in the stories try to exert control not merely over their bodies, but also over their internal narratives. Fisher by trying to confabulate and expiate this imaginary crime, and Ella by literally embroidering her imminent suicide. But these attempts to sustain narrative sense are continually subverted by the bodies that underwrite them. And when Dublin does actually cure and redeem the sexually violent and shell-shocked Franz Bieberkopf, Franz Beaverhead, at the end of his epic novel Berlin Alexanderplatz, Bieberkopf can only be safely reinserted into Berlin life, his narrative normalised, because his head's been well and truly knocked into shape in an insane asylum, and he's renounced most of his sexual desires. So, to sum it all up, Dublin offers us here pictures of pathology in order to sort of critique and unsettle non-existent conditions of normality and stability. The relationship between mind, body, and materiality more generally is immeasurably more entangled, certainly than many of his Wilhelmine contemporaries would admit, or perhaps even more than we still realise. And perhaps it's no surprise after all that Günter Grass told his middle-class audience to line their stomachs, swallow hard, and think very carefully before reading. Thank you.